back on track a little bit. If you remember, the issue of the moment right now is simply the most important thing that happened in colonial America. And the most important thing that happened was this transformation of people. These people came from the old world, and intriguingly, of course, the transformation is also the New World people. The Native Americans will be transformed also. But we focus kind of on the old world people. They come to this new location. They are involved in this new climate. It is a new social mix. It's a new cultural mix. It's new economic activities, just the variety of things that are happening in America. And they are transformed by it. They couldn't help themselves but be transformed by it. And what they become are Americans. We have no other better way of describing them, so becoming Americans becomes this essential thing. We've already gone through a number of the characteristics or developments that will lead them to become Americans. I told you about their population. It's an incredibly dynamic population growth, the fastest growing population in the world, underwritten by a tremendously high rate of natural increase, but also, of course, immigrants who are coming to America. That began a foundation of just enough people. And it's it doesn't have to be a ton of people. It's enough people, of course, to make it work as far as America is concerned. As the population grew, it began to define itself in terms of social structure. I want you guys to simply know that the Americans developed for themselves a unique social structure and a relatively benign social structure compared to just about anyone else in the entire world. And we see that through the distribution of wealth. We see that in the fact that the vast majority of Americans are simply middle-class, self-sustaining farmers, which puts them in a relatively good situation. And we see that in the fact that they have this deferential society, which is indeed an elite-driven society where the elites have dominion. But remember, I told you it's a gentle dominion because it's a voluntary structure. And the elites understood they could not come down hard on the lower class people. It's not even the lower class, the middle class, and anyone below them, basically. They couldn't come down hard. Well, those people could just reject it. They walk away, go someplace else, or tell them to go screw themselves, if they really wanted to. So he creates this kind of social structure which is controlled by the elites, but will also evolve or devolve towards an egalitarian social structure, which of course is the ultimate outcome as far as America is concerned. And the final thing I told you about was the economic growth, and I hope that each point is designed to impress you that something really special is happening here. Fastest growing population in the entire world, most benign social structure, and a very, very strong economy. Fastest growing economy in the entire world, highest per capita income in the entire world. Those are two dramatic kind of aspects of colonial America, which should tell you a lot. Now, I told you that it's a strong economy based on rapid population growth in a good resource-based area, based on consistent export trade in agricultural commodities, especially things like tobacco, but also rice, indigo, corn, and wheat. And then based on this deep involvement in overseas trade. The Americans simply got themselves involved in the Atlantic Sea trade in a way that would allow them tremendous success. I think I was very rushed at the very end of that, but I want to tell you that it's a result of the Navigation Acts, ironically, that the English tried to control American trade, but the Americans learned to use it and manipulate it and ultimately prosper from it. And in the end, the Americans were major players in the Atlantic Sea trade, in the so-called Triangle Trade. Triangle Trade simply focused on the three major items that were being traded at that time. It's slaves, rum, and sugar. Those are the big three, basically. And the Americans are really involved in this, and carrying the trade and smuggling like it's going out of style, right, of course, not really suffering any consequences from that in any particular kind of way, allowing them a very robust economy. And the last thing I wanted to say to you guys about the economy, and I don't think I got to it, economic growth was a double-edged sword for the Americans. On the one hand, it made them strong, confident, and self-confident. And I want you guys to know that I don't think the Americans ever would have tried to be independent if they didn't feel economically strong. You are not technically really independent until you are economically independent. So tragically, I have to tell both my daughters that they are not independent at this moment because I'm still paying some of their bills, okay? I will as long as I have to, and it's maybe the issues of the millennium that's taken them a while to get their own jobs. When they get their own jobs, one daughter has her job, but she's still having to pay super high rents living in Santa Barbara. Oh crap, So I still pay for her phone, and I still pay her gasoline and stuff like that. Not that I'm complaining. Anyway, but the moment she gets like the job that pays, I'm going to be like, that'll be independence from me. Independence Day for me. Anyway, you're not truly independent unless you are economically independent. Okay? I think that's just the essential reality. And the Americans felt good about themselves economically, which will lead them to even contemplate the possibility of independence, right? But here's the other side of the equation. The success of the colonies began to drive a wedge between the colonies and the British. The British didn't like the Americans being so successful. And to me, it's ridiculous because in a modern economy, both sides can generate the economic growth, and it's good for everybody, right? But the British wanted all of it, or they wanted more of the piece of the pie, and they didn't like the Americans were getting too much of it. And when the British tried to mess with the American economy, that's the beginning of the end. You can't let people mess with your economy. Your economy is like the essence of who you are, essentially. So when the British try to mess with this, to even a small degree, that's going to push the Americans to contemplate and then move towards, of course, independence in a fairly aggressive way. Okay. As their population grew, their social structures developed, as their economy grew, they also began to develop for themselves what we call a political culture. Political culture. I'll do this one quick, but I want to give it to you, okay? Political culture is an interesting concept, which you have to the way that I like to envision it is to perceive it as this huge sphere. And the reason I want to perceive it as a huge sphere is that I want to be able to go into it, but I also want to go out of it, all right? Because it has to do with inside that sphere. Just let's walk into the sphere for a second, all right? Inside that sphere, and for some reason I'm seeing it as translucent so we can look right into it. So let's just stay outside. No, let's walk in. Inside that sphere is everything about American politics and American government, okay? And first of all, you guys should know that today that's a really big sphere, right? And it's an incredibly interesting sphere and in many ways messed up sphere. What can I say? So you walk into the sphere and it's everything about politics and everything about government, all right? So what does that mean? That means campaigning, of course. It means the political parties, the Democrats and Republicans. It means partisanship, and it means signs that are placed all over the roads when we're coming to election, and really annoying advertisements or ads on the television or on the radio or something like that you can't wait till they're over with, that kind of thing, and all the voting activities we have. Everything about government, of course, local government, state government, and federal government. The president, of course, is a component of the House of Representatives, the Senate, the Supreme Court, all the components of our governing apparatus, all the components of our you can understand them as being within the sphere that we could call the political culture, okay, of the United States of America. The political culture of the United States of America is the biggest political culture in the entire world. It's just an amazing thing, of course. And by the way, inside that there is so much money that you can't believe it, right? It's all that fundraising and all the lobbying efforts that take place, and of course with all that money, it's not overt corruption, but there's a level of the influence of money becomes problematic in a variety of different ways. Anyway, the reason I want to see that all in a sphere is because I'm willing to go into it periodically, but I want to get the hell out of there. I swear, I go into American political activities in our government, it starts to drive me a little bit crazy, okay? And so I just want to leave. I want to walk out the door, slam it behind me, and just have nothing to do with American government and nothing to do with American politics. And forgive me for that, okay? I'm still going to go in there and vote every time I have to, and I'm going to pay attention often. I'm going to venture in there, but that's the reason I like to see it in the sphere. So I can close the door and walk away for a little while, just to get some peace of mind, if nothing else, okay? All right. And that's a really negative attitude, forgive me for all that, but maybe some of you share some of those kind of similar feelings. Inside that monstrous sphere is a small nucleus, okay? If we get into it deep enough, we're going to find a nucleus. And that nucleus is the political culture of the colonies, okay? Because it's the seed, it's the kernel that becomes the seed of this huge political culture. It was much smaller, of course, because so much less going on, so much less money involved and all that kind of stuff, So just all the trappings of government were so much more limited in many ways, and politics also. So it's much smaller, but it was there. And it's critical to understand it because it is the beginning of this massive political culture that you and I live in today, all right? So let me just give you a sense of it. And the critical point is the Americans were building a political culture, and it was uniquely theirs, right? That's the whole point. This is something uniquely American in the way that begins to develop. Now what I want to do with you is just tell you 3 things about the political culture. And believe it or not, it's so simple that we could really kind of cover it with just 3 things. Now we don't have to talk about a whole bunch of stuff here. So here's the first thing. And the first thing is that for every political culture, there has to be something that we might call a primary value. Now this is something that becomes this is the most essential component of your political culture. And it routinely is critically important. It's critically important. Okay? And I guess I'm just going to jump to it. How do you describe how important it is? It's so important that you will die for it, okay? You will die for it. And that has to be critically important. There aren't many things you're going to willing to die for, right? But generally speaking, this is that kind of thing, right? There's something that's so important to you that you are willing to die for. And I'm going to just describe this as the primary culture of the political culture, primary value of the political culture of colonial America. Okay, let me set this up for you guys. As the Americans lived in the colonies, they just felt there was something special about it, okay? And the primary thing that they kind of fell in love with was the fact that there were no limitations, no boundaries, no restrictions. And you should see that both as a physical kind of thing, right? Because think of it. And this is horrible that they're not even thinking that there are Native Americans out there, but they're not even thinking that there are Native Americans out there, right? I mean, they know they're there and they have to deal with them, but they're not thinking like that's an obstacle in that kind of way. So you could go anywhere you wanted to go. You could do anything you wanted to do, essentially, without restriction, without boundary, without anything inhibiting you or limiting you in any particular kind of way, right? And they began to see that as like a fundamental good. This is good stuff. You get to do what you want, go where you want, act out the way you want, whatever it is you want to do. Not absolutely, of course, but to a very significant degree, you could do what you want to do. And so because they began to see this as like the essence of their existence and critically important to them, they began to shape it into what we call their political primary value. So can you guess? I've tried to avoid using the words that we might be using, I perhaps could use here. Can you guess what their primary value was?
Freedom.
Okay, I'm glad you said freedom because that's wrong. But it's really important for me to kind of understand this. When you say words, you and I, and freedom is not wrong, but it is kind of wrong, okay? It's wrong in the sense that it's not the word they use. That's the primary thing. But the thing that I'm interested in, the colonists, and it's kind of sad about us as Americans, we don't use words carefully that much anymore. I'm as bad as anybody, and I use more words than anybody else in this class, right? Now, there's sometimes when I'm throwing crap out to you that I'm really not sure what that word means, okay? But I think it sounds kind of cool, and it sounds like scholarly or something like that, so I just throw it in there. I was after I do it, you see a little hesitation. Is anyone going to figure out what that one? Does anyone know what that really means? And you guys are always usually cool. We don't know what it really means either. So, but the colonists were always careful with language. They wanted to use the words that were when it's a primary value, you got to be really important. You can't just throw some word out there. Okay? So let me tell you why they didn't say that freedom was their primary value. And you have to go back to the root of the word and the absolute understanding of the word to really kind of get what's going on. The word freedom, it comes to us from the Germanic peoples. So it's German, okay, or Germanic. The word freedom first appears kind of in the general understanding of the world about the time of the Roman Empire. And I'm sure it's the Romans who wrote it down because the Germanic people couldn't write it down, so they're going to have somebody else. I don't think they could write it at that time. Maybe they could. I'm going too far there. But this was a German word. It was created by the Germanic tribes that lived on the other side of the Rhine, and who had never been conquered, who were never significantly conquered by the Romans. And indeed, they began to see this as like their chief attribute, that they were able to resist the Romans. You've got to understand how powerful the Romans were, right? If you could resist the Romans, that's a big deal at that time. So they come up with this word, and the word, it evolves towards what we say call free, or freedom if you want, okay? And I think they would have said it just like free. I think that's the original pronunciation of it. The word was so important to them, it became kind of like the moniker that they would use to describe themselves. So as they began to describe themselves, they called themselves the Franks. And the Franks just means the free people, the free people. You see at least the first consonants, right, that make up the word free right there, okay? And by the way, the Franks will later invade into Gaul, and they will conquer Gaul when the Roman Empire is collapsing, and they will create a country there that kind of resonates with the same word. You guys know what that country will become?
France.
Pardon me?
France.
It's France, okay? So France basically just means free, It's like they're the free people or something like that. It's intriguing, that, right? By the way, I love how there's a softening. As soon as they intermix with the Latin, you create one of the Romance languages, which you have the Germanic influences, but also the heavy-duty Latin kind of influences. So Frank softens to France, and their original kings, or the chieftains, really were called Clovis, and Clovis softens to, can you guess, the primary name of the kings of France? Clovis goes to, remember the 16th one got his head chopped off? That's not enough to help you guys. Hopefully people watching this film will be yelling out, Louis! So Clovis goes to Louis, okay? Louis is the kings of France. That, for some reason, that came out really hard. I'm going through the change right now, okay? But it made the point, I don't care. So this is a Germanic word, okay? And here's the thing that you need to understand. When the Germans said, these Germanic tribes, the Frankish people said free, they meant it absolutely. So freedom is an absolute concept. What that means is nothing to restrict you from doing anything you want to do. Nothing whatsoever to restrict you, right? So that's the true meaning of the word freedom. Nothing to restrict you. Now you guys all know that there are certain areas where that's totally appropriate, like freedom of thought. There should never be anything to restrict you in terms of your thinking. Now freedom is potential restrictions though upon it, right? Because you can say certain things that can be really, really damaging. So that's not an absolute situation necessarily, right? But sometimes it's absolutely appropriate. Now the Germans meant this they meant it very literally. The freedom to do whatever you want to do. And so one thing that meant about the Germanic society was they were violent places, because if you wanted to kill someone, you could kill someone. If you wanted to rape someone, you could rape someone. If you wanted that man's wife, you could kill him and take her. You could do this kind of stuff. They were absolutely free to do what they wanted to do. And you guys all perhaps see that there are problems with absolute freedom, right? If you live in a society with absolute freedom, you live in a society with potential absolute chaos and violence too, all right? So this is not the word that the colonists understood what that word meant. It was an absolute concept, all right? So they decided, they couldn't quite go with freedom because it has certain meanings that they can't quite abide with, right? So they did not choose the word freedom. Instead, they chose a word that is synonymous with freedom. Can you guys help me on? Liberty? Here we go, liberty, okay? Basically means the same thing, right? So this is the primary value. The primary value of colonial America was liberty. And I tried to set it up for you guys because I told you that they were willing to die for it. And that's the foundation of one of the more famous sentences, of course, of protest, give me liberty or give me death. I'm willing to die for this thing. That's how important it is to me, essentially. That's how important it was to the Americans. Well, let me just give you the roots of the word liberty. It's a Latin word, so this is coming to us from the Romans. And the Romans created, of course, the Republic way back in 500 BC or whatever it was, and liberty became a central value as far as they were concerned, too. Now, they imposed the notion of liberty, but it means kind of freedom, but it has a distinction that I think is really kind of important, right? So let me define for you the word liberty in its absolute definition. Liberty means the freedom to do what you want to do. Isn't it interesting that I have to use the word freedom to describe the word liberty? But you do, kind of. The freedom to do what you want to do, but within the confines of the law. Within the confines of the law. They found this as a more effective way to have a civil society, a relative level of freedom, but with some limitations upon it. And if you guys don't quite understand the distinction, I'm going to give it to you really quickly, okay? So do not do this. I'm just suggesting, of course, as a thought process. Let's say that you want to drive home today under the concept of freedom. You're going to drive home and you're free to do whatever you want to do, okay? You probably begin to see the potentials, the problems here. So you're driving in your car and you're going down the road and all of a sudden there's an octagonal sign in there with some white letters on it, 4 of them, and you don't give a damn because you're free, right? And you blow through that sucker, right? Because that's what you can do when you're free, essentially. And then you see a set of lights over the intersection or something like that. And the light is red, but what the hell, man? I'm free. I can do whatever I want. You blow right through that, okay? Then you're a few miles down the road and you think, the English people drive on the left side of the road. I wonder what that's like, So you just go over to the left-hand side of the road and you start driving there, okay? If you do those things, of course, you can kill yourself and you can kill somebody else, right? Yeah. So we want you to be free to go home. No one wants to inhibit you in that particular way, but you must go home within the confines of the law. You must stop at the stop signs. You must stop at the stop light. You must stay to the right-hand side of the road. Okay. All of these things are essential aspects of liberty. Free to do what you want to do, but within the confines of the law. So that's the word the colonists will accept. We must have some limitations. We cannot allow people to be so free that they can create anarchy and chaos and violence. We have to have some kind of something to hold us within the structures of a civil society. So as they adopt their primary value, they began to focus on this word liberty, and liberty becomes the essence of it is their primary value. Okay, and they saw liberty as the font of everything good in their world. They said, look at our population growth. It's all about liberty, right? Look at our benign social structure. It's all about rooted in liberty. Look at our economy. It's all about liberty, right? The freedom to do what we want to do within the confines of the law as far as our economy is concerned, essentially. So, liberty was the essence of their existence. It was the most important thing. And remember that I told you that they loved it and they were willing to die for it. That becomes like a critical thing. I do want you to know that as we go forward in time in America, so I'm jumping out of colonial America into the larger political culture, I kind of believe that we kind of assign other primary values, so it's not just liberty today. So increasingly we think about things like equality and justice, other primary values that we kind of put together. And intriguingly, at least to me, equality and liberty do not always jive with each other as primary values. Because liberty means the freedom to do whatever you want, including making all kinds of money and screwing people. Equality means maybe you should have equal opportunity. We shouldn't inhibit those who have too much money so that people live a better life and have better, whatever. Those two things aren't necessarily going to always work together. I always think to myself that the conservatives in America are focused primarily upon liberty, and the liberals are focusing a little more on equality. They're two good, powerful values, of course, but not that the liberal denies liberty, of course, and they want that too. Not that the conservative would deny equality on certain levels, of course, they want that too. But anyway, in the beginning, there was just one value, and it was liberty, and this is the primary value for the colonial America. Okay, so and the root of everything good as far as the society was concerned. Now, if there are certain things that you love more than anything else, there's probably going to be something that you really hate too. It's kind of tragic that this is primary hate. Primary dislike. So the thing you value the most, primary concern. So it's more than that. I want you to think of it almost like it's a hatred. Okay? There's things you like, there's things you're going to dislike. But in politics, fear plays a big part, and I'm really not happy about that necessarily. You've possibly seen how this can be generated. This can generate, of course, votes. You simply present the fear and make it a big deal, make it an issue. Often blow it beyond what it really is, too, and then that becomes a foundation of how you're going to garner support one way or the other. But I got to tell you, this has been there forever. This is nothing new invented by recent politicians. They've used fear for just about since the beginning of the American political apparatus. Anyway, if you're going to love something, you're also going to hate something else, okay? And you can think like in contemporary or mid-20th century America, they would have loved liberty, they would have hated communism or something like that. Okay? This is going to be something you're going to be really hostile to. Anyway, can you guess the thing that the Americans feared the most or were most concerned with, essentially, in terms of their political culture? And of course, it was the thing that could do damage to liberty. So can you help me here? What would be, what's almost like the opposite of liberty? That's not a good clue. If you love liberty, what do you fear? War. You can love liberty and fight for it. So actually, you're not going to. No, people don't like war, of course. I don't think they would love it. Think more of the things that can impinge upon your liberty. Pardon?
Dictatorship?
Okay, it's the right direction. What does the dictatorship have that can damage liberty? Pardon me?
Power.
Okay, we get to find the word. A lot of times people throw out things like dictatorship or oppression or tyranny. Those are all good words, right? But the question becomes, what is the foundation of oppression, dictatorship, and tyranny? And the word that they used was power. They were afraid of power. This is, of course, political power. Political power just becomes this kind of focal point of their concern, essentially, within their political culture, and it became a huge deal as far as they were concerned. Every American, even the kids, I'm thinking, began to understand the sort of essential political maxim that would be stated routinely, okay? And that is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This was an adage that was known by every American. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. How many of you believe that power corrupts? I'm pretty much a believer that power corrupts, okay? It's that weird kind of thing. It can just happen to you. I think something happens to you. It's like, I'm afraid of winning the lottery and becoming rich because I think it would be corruptive of me. And you guys ever seen some of those documentaries on the people who win the lottery? It's so funny because right after they win, they're always like, well, nothing's going to change. We're going to live in the same old house, blah, blah, blah. And then like a year later, they're living in Boca Raton. I can't even think of it. What's Boca Raton? That fancy place down in Florida. Damn it, Chris, it doesn't work if you don't know the name of the thing you're talking about. Some fancy place down in Florida, in this big old mansion painted yellow or something like that, with a garage that holds 17 cars. Oh yeah, nothing changed at all. Okay, So I have winter lottery phobia. I think that's what we should say. Winter lottophobia. Let's do it like that. Sounds a little. I'm afraid if I would win the lottery, of course, then it would corrupt me in some kind of weird way, and I go wacko. So I want you to know that I'm not in real danger. I never buy a lottery ticket. No real danger to impact. What if someone accidentally gave me a lottery ticket one day and then I won? I'm like, oh my God, it's happening. I always think to myself, maybe you guys could help me by calling me quickly and disabusing me all my money. But you have to call quick because the corruption happens fast. Screw you, man. I got $1 million. I'm going to keep it now. Anyway, I do believe that power corrupts. And the colonists were convinced absolutely that power was this extremely corruptive thing, okay? So this was and for them, if liberty is the font of everything good, then power is the font of everything bad. Power is the root of tyranny, of abuse, of arbitrary activities of the government, one thing after another. Okay, all the bad comes from power, essentially. All the good comes from liberty. Yes.
There's also the power of knowledge, not just money.
Good one. But we're talking about political power, so we have to kind of focus our. I don't think they would have thought about that. They would have thought of what. Gosh, that's almost interesting though, because the Bible would argue that power is a corrupted device. Okay, knowledge is corrupted. Power of knowledge is corrupted. But interesting point. But I don't think they're thinking like that. Okay, because the power of knowledge is actually going to perhaps enhance your liberty, right? It's going to add to your freedom. Anyway, but they're not seeing that. They're not worried. They're not worried about that particular issue. Okay, that becomes the point. So instead, they just see power as a problem. Now, this leads to actually a conundrum for their political culture because they believe in liberty. You guys remember the definition of liberty. Liberty is the freedom to do what you want to do, but within the confines of the law. Now, for there to be law, there has to be government. And for the government to be effective in upholding those laws, the government has to have power, okay? So they understood that power was something that you kind of needed. But the question for them became, how do you create a government, or what kind of government is the good question, that will do the most to sustain liberty, to uphold liberty, and to hold down power. That became the essential kind of government. And so they began to think on this, of course, and they didn't really think that much because they were already doing what they wanted to be doing here. But they came with what they thought was the most appropriate form of government for their political culture. Can you guess what I'm about to write on the board? What kind of government did they believe in? You were supposed to write it for both the traditions established by Virginia and Massachusetts Bay. What kind of government did they have? Oh crap, I'm a crap teacher. Remember the representative government thing that I told you about?
Republic.
They believe in you can say that, but it's not yet a republic because they are on their own. So it's just within their own colonies, they wanted representative forms of government. Representative government for them was the safest form of government. It would be a government that would represent them, of course. It would be a government that would be responsible to the voters. Remember that if you vote for someone, of course, you do empower them, but if they screw up, you can vote them out of office. Go for somebody else. It was a government that they felt that they could be in touch with. They wanted to know their representatives, and I want to know my representatives too. Wouldn't that be great? And they did actually. They were close enough that they could just communicate with them. Send them a letter, and the guy would actually read it or something like that. I always feel like you can send an email to your representative in Congress, but you all know that you're one of a million representatives, and that he's not going to read it or she's not going to read it directly. It's going to be read by some secretary or somebody else. They're going to just take a poll of whatever it is or something like that. Hard to communicate. They want to be communicated, right? But they began to really put their faith essentially in representative government. And the critical point, of course, for this story is that they're the only people in the world that are really doing this in a significant way. Yesterday, my student just said, what about the Parliament in Great Britain? That is a representative form of government, right? So, what are we talking about? But Parliament represented about 17% of all the people of Great Britain. So it's really an elite representation situation. In colonial America, they were trying to represent the mass of the people, of course. Now, I want you to know it's not everybody, right? Women are not voting. Of course, slaves and black people are not voting in any kind of way. But they generally allow the vast majority of white men to vote. So it does represent at least the white male population. Just to let you know, if you look at representation for colonial America, you go from a low of 60%, that would have been South Carolina. South Carolina was a little more restrictive, requiring property, I think real property in terms of right to vote, to Massachusetts with a 90% representation. So the vast majority of white men in Massachusetts could vote, and indeed, became part of the process. So, they began to put their faith, their notion, their focus into representative government. And as you know, it will not only be, of course, the governing apparatus of colonial America, but of the United States of America. Right? This is the beginning of a political culture, which becomes critically important in the long run. So just three simple things to understand about the colonial political culture: how much they loved liberty and saw it as the foundation of their existence, how much they were concerned with power and sought to really inhibit it in many ways they could, but how they put their ultimate faith in a representative form of government that would do as much as it could to enhance liberty and to hold down power. And that's kind of been the ultimate problem of America from that day to this. How do we create a government that sustains our liberty and yet, does not become too powerful? And I'm sure you guys know that the story of America is the story of the government getting more and more powerful all the time, okay? But I also want you to know that there have been a lot of acts that have tried to increase the relative democracy of America to allow you and I to be more a part of it. Remember, in the beginning, it was just white men who voted, right? It's not just white men anymore, right? It's more and more the people who get to be part of the equation here, get to have their say in direct election of senators and direct primaries and initiative referendums and recalls and all kinds of stuff that will involve us in a variety of ways. So, and who's to say it's perfect? I'm worried about the power of the United States government as much as anybody, okay? It continues to be kind of the essence of the way that we are attempting to proceed, right? So as the Americans are developing themselves, of course, they're also creating a political culture which is relatively benign and unique, really, among the people of the world. There's a special system developing here. Everything the Americans do is kind of special, right? It becomes another foundation of this transformation of these people into becoming Americans. All right, my last thing I want to tell you about for this section is what I call cultural expressions. And I guess just to give you a sense of what's going on, I'm sure you guys know that the cultural expression of the United States of America today is just massive, right? Our culture influences more of the world than any other culture. It just radiates out from the United States of America. And what I love about it is, like Southern California youth influence the world. I think that's the coolest thing, right? Because you guys know that there are skaters all around the entire world now, pretty much started here, people. I was kind of there on the ground floor of a lot of the skateboarding. My original skateboard had metal wheels. You took them off the old the little skates that you would tie onto your feet, and you had to have a key to put them onto your shoe. They actually fit onto your shoe, and we just put those on the bottom of a board, and we started skating with metal wheels. And of course, metal wheels were fun. The second you hit any kind of hard thing, you're just like. And then we went to clay. And clay was better, they were wider essentially, so it gave more foundation, but I'll never get riding down my street, I'm just skateboarding on my board, and I put my hands in my pocket acting like I was really cool. We had a lot of palm trees, and they had just those little palm nut dates, they're not really dates, I don't know what the hell they are. But I just hit one of those with one of my front wheels, and the skateboard stopped dead. And of course, I could not get my hands out of my pockets in time, just face planted on the cement. That would hurt badly. Anyway, and then of course came I can't remember, they're plastic wheels, of course, which were better, a little more flexible. Skateboards got longer, of course. By that time, by the way, I'm moving out of that period of my entire life. I did my few crazy things on a skateboard, but then I had to kind of move on. But anyway, just think about that. So that means in Southern California, like surfer look or beach look or something like that. Not to mention, of course, just the general music of California, how that can reach out. And you guys all know that, back in the 1930s, 90% of all movies in the world were produced in Hollywood. So, this is a place that just radiates cultural expressions, for good or for bad. The good news is, of course, we have really cool music and cool styles and whatever. The bad news is like McDonald's going everywhere or something like that. Coca-Cola everywhere in the world. Our consumer culture, but our television shows, our movies, our music just radiates out. I don't know why, but whenever I see like Green Day in concert in Finland and all the Finns going crazy, I feel good about that. It's like, oh my God, there are people in Finland, they don't even know what these there's. I'm not even sure. It's better when it's like in Japan though, because oh my God, they love that even in Japan, wherever it is where the culture might be somewhat distinct. Anyway, today we got a monster culture, right, and it influences the entire world. I'm sure you guys know that, okay? Colonial America couldn't do that. I can't tell you that, okay? But they began to be their own people in unique kind of ways, and they began to express themselves in unique kind of ways that I do want you to be aware of, So Americans being Americans. And I got to tell you, this is kind of just a potpourri of presentation, just things I'm kind of in my head and I want to present to you guys. But I do think that they begin to tell something about the Americans in terms of the cultural expressions. So what I'll start with is education. The Americans began to create something of an educational process. Write it down like that if you're going to write it, okay? Educational process. Which was quite unique. So here we go. First of all, I need you to know that there were no public schools in America, okay? No public schools in America. The public school concept is relative to the 19th century development at best, okay? The closest you come to like a public school in colonial America where the Puritans had a rule, remember the Puritans really emphasized the notion of reading so you can read the Bible? So the Puritans said that if you have 100 families in a village, then you have to have a school. And of course, that was the rule, but was it enforced? That became the issue. And sometimes yes, if there was availability, and sometimes no. And even when it was yes, we're talking a school that might be there for a couple weeks out of the entire year or something, that's not really happening. So forget about it. There's not going to be a public school in America. Now, for the wealthy, of course, they could sometimes create private schools for themselves, and that did happen. The planters in Virginia would create like an academy, and it would be for all the neighborhood planter kids that they could go. If they were wealthier, they often hired their own personal tutor, brought them into their house, just taught their kids. And if they were even wealthier than that, they sent their kids to England to go to the actual public schools, which, by the way, in England are not public, they're private, Eton and places like that. If you really wanted to get your kid educated, you send them back to England to be educated. Sometimes they would send them to the public schools of England, sometimes they would send them to Oxford and Cambridge to really get that education so they could come back, of course, to America and be very damn impressive. But there really just isn't any public school or any just generalized school system in America whatsoever. And yet there's something of an interesting process, okay? And here's the outcome of the process. The Americans had an extraordinarily high literacy rate in colonial America. I think it's the highest in the entire world. I have found no evidence to suggest you have a higher literacy rate than in America. For white men, and remember that we have to do these kind of racial distinctions and, of course, sexual distinctions, because it's not going to be the same for everybody. White men, we're looking at probably close to, not quite, but I'm going to just go with it. Make your point by overemphasis to a degree. Close to 90% white male literacy. Close to 90% white male literacy. And I just need you to know that that is extraordinary in many ways. There are particular groups around the world that had a higher sense of male literacy. So the Jews had a high sense of male literacy. Of course, they need to read the Torah, the Talmud to do their thing. For the Japanese samurai, very high rate of literacy, because there's a scholarly component along with the warrior component of that, you know. But, you know, you look at England, you're not going to see over 50% male literacy in England until like the 1850s. It's going to take a long time to generate up to 50%. Here, we're looking at 90%, okay? So that's extraordinary in many ways, and becoming one of the kind of interesting components of America. Can you guess what would have been important in America to have a high rate of white male literacy? What would be the driving force that would make these guys want to be able to read and write? Pardon me? Well, go ahead, come on. There's no such thing as a bad statement in this class. I've been making like so many bad statements in this class. I deserve someone else to make bad statements. Can you guess? And I just gave you a hint.
So they could do like government type stuff?
Okay, exactly. It's the political notion, right? They want to be involved in politics. You can't be involved in politics unless you're reading and being aware of what's going on. The only other impetus that I want you to be aware of course, is the Puritans, religious. They also want to be able to read the Bible. Okay, there's more Protestants than just Puritans, so they all want to be able to read the Bible. So anyway, you do kind of generate this desire for basic literacy, and we see it manifesting in the 90%. One thing that is intriguing about America also, though, was that they had a relatively high rate of white female literacy. So we're looking at about 50%. So it's, you know, significantly less than the men, but still, that's high by global standards. I'm guessing by global standards at this time, we're looking at probably less than 10% female literacy in the entire world. So all of a sudden, the Americans are just standing out like it's going out of style. Intriguingly, can you guess why they wanted white women to be able to read and write?
People to be teachers.
You're pretty much right. To teach who?
Their children.
More specifically? To teach their sons. I find it so ironic, right? You're teaching the women so they can teach their sons, but it still has the impact of teaching the women, you know, so it's not a bad thing in any kind of way. And I'm only hoping that they taught their daughters also as they're teaching their sons, but you know, anyway, I think that's the primary rationale here. We need them. Dad is often too busy doing his thing, right? So he has to get mom to make sure that you're doing the, you know, learning the letters and all that kind of stuff with the kids, etc. So it's primarily about teaching these men how to read. Now here becomes the important part. So it's not a system of education, but it's a process of education. You guys understand how something's happening here, but it's clearly not systemic or anything like that. So just for fun, it's pretty easy. If there were no schools in America, what became the school?
Church.
Not the church. That's a good one, but it's not the church. Where did they live?
Home.
They live in their home. So what we're looking at here is classic homeschooling, right? It's homeschooling par excellence. Now, if there were no teachers, who became the teachers? We've already established this. It's the parents generally, okay? Sometimes the mom. And can you guess, just for fun, what was the primary textbook that they would learn from? It was the Bible. So it's real simple. And I do need you to understand, this is not high-level learning, okay? So don't picture these people as being, you know, very learned. They were simply basic competency in literacy, essentially. And usually literacy and figuring, you know, doing their simple mathematics. That's what they could do. So they're not reading every damn book they could find. It'd be hard to find that many books, unless you were part of the elite. The elite did have substantial reading, of course, of libraries and things like that. But the common middle-class American, remember they're 80%, these agricultural middle-class Americans, they're just going for basic competency of literacy and figuring and stuff like that that will allow them to be politically aware and do the simple things they need to kind of run their household. That becomes the essential part of this, right? But, so anyway, it's homeschooling working out in just an amazing kind of way, right? And so we have to see that's the process. That's the essential process. Now here's to me what I consider the irony of colonial America. There are no public schools, no lower level education whatsoever, and yet there were colleges. They had colleges. It just seems backwards, right? You should start from the ground up in education, right? But instead they started from the top down, basically. And through the colonial period, they began to develop colleges, and it's not just that they're colleges, but these will become world-class universities over time. That becomes part of the story. Okay, so just for fun, can you guess the very first college in America? founded in 1636 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Is that enough for y'all? Starts with an H.
Harvard.
What was it?
Harvard.
There we go, Harvard. There's so many things I want you to be aware of. Part of it is that this shows you the Puritan level of success. It took them 6 years to get a college going, for crying out loud. I mean, these guys, this is the howling wilderness. 6 years later, they've got a college. Now, we have to go not too far here. The college was a one-room building. You know, so it would be like this classroom. And what happened was a man by the name of John Harvard dedicated or donated his books, his library, substantial library, to the college, of course, to create the foundation for it. I also want you to know that they really only focused on one thing, or there's just one particular group of people they wanted to train in the beginning at Harvard College. Can you guess who it was? Remember, they're Puritans. Who do you want to train? Not women. They're Puritans.
Oh, minister?
They want to train the ministers. So Harvard began as a theological seminary, basically. So it was all about theology, okay? But within years, they had a legal component to it, too. So they wanted to make a law school. So, I mean, it doesn't take long. You guys all know over time, Harvard will become a major university, one of the preeminent universities as far as the world is concerned. So, I mean, this is that kind of foundation beginning. The second oldest college in America was founded in 1683. I'm going to give you some hints here. It was in Virginia. It's two people's names put together. Is that enough? It was the King and Queen of England at that time. You guys haven't heard of this before? It's called the College of William and Mary. College of William and Mary is located in Williamsburg. It's just outside kind of the boundaries of the Williamsburg area. I went to the curb there one time. You're in Williamsburg. Williamsburg is kind of like a historical Disneyland. I think it's like $30+ to get in there, unless they're doing just what Disneyland does now. So it's $150 to get in there or something like that. I swear, Disneyland prices are just crazy. Anyway, back on topic. I was at Williamsburg, and if you go to the edge of Williamsburg, you look across, and that's the College of William and Mary. And it's kind of, it's an interesting looking place. The buildings were designed by Christopher Wren, who's the same guy who did St. Paul's Cathedral in London, so that's kind of a cool thing about it. But I feel bad that I did not take the time to cross the street, just walk into the campus a little bit just to get a feel for it. So I've been to the edge of it, I've looked at it, and that was the end of that particular story. But the College of William and Mary was the second one. The third one was founded in 1701. Chief rival to Harvard in the long run. Is that enough for you guys? In New Haven, Connecticut? Yale. This tells us part of the story. All of these colleges are denominational. So what does that mean? Denominational colleges?
Like religious?
They're religiously affiliated. Now I want you guys to know that that is not exceptional at all. In the beginning, all universities were religiously affiliated. So in the beginning of the medieval university, they're all built by the Roman Catholic Church, for crying out loud, okay? University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Padua, doesn't matter. They're all Catholic universities designed primarily to train priests and monks, okay? That's what they were designed from the very beginning. So the notion of a denominational college, that's all they were at the beginning, right? The public university is a new concept. It's a 19th century concept, really, okay? So that, you look back, they're all religious. I will tell you there's one exception to that particular at this particular moment. Harvard was Puritan, William and Mary was Anglican. Yale was a Puritan revival college, which was trying to regenerate the city upon a hill. Believe it or not, they're still thinking about the city upon a hill in 1701, trying to get this going again. Like, come on, we can build it back up, et cetera, et cetera. Now, forgive me, but I can't remember the dates or the rest of them. They're all in the 1700s. So one was founded called King's College. It was located in New Jersey. It's now a very famous university. Albert Einstein went there. They're the Tigers. Their colors are orange and black. Not enough for you guys. Albert Einstein went there. That's not a good. They've played a couple times in the NCAA tournament and defeated people. Okay, that's enough for you guys. Princeton. You guys ever heard of Princeton before? Of course, a major university in America. There was one called Queens College, located outside of Harlem in New York City. Now, you guys know that anything called King's College in the beginning or Queens College is going to change with the Revolution. So that one is not called Vespucci College, but it's called. Well, that was a good hint. Who's the other guy? Vespucci and Columbia. Okay, you guys ever heard of Columbia? Well, that's one of them. Brown University, of course, that was founded in Providence, Rhode Island. Dartmouth was founded in New Hampshire. I'm running out of them. The one that I can remember, the last one, was called the College of Philadelphia. It was founded in 1756, I think, by Benjamin Franklin himself. And he wanted it to be non-sectarian, which meant that it was not religiously affiliated. So that's the only one that is now called the University of Pennsylvania. You guys have been listening to you, but I've described almost the entire Ivy League being created during the colonial period. Okay, so it just kind of shows you. And the thing that I'm interested in here is that this meant that the Americans were thinking about the future, right? They are planning for the future. They want to train the future leadership. And not only will they create colleges, but all of them will become world-class universities. They'll become dominant as far as global higher education is concerned. So this is the foundation of something really important. So all of this becomes this intriguing educational process of relatively high literacy, and for some strange reason, no public schools but colleges. There's something backward about that, but it works. What can I say? It becomes part of the cultural expression of the Americans. Here's some other ones I'll do for you. I want to tell you a little bit about colonial art. I must confess, I'm not really big on art. Not exactly art appreciation. I love that stuff. I love to go look at the art and things like that. The only problem is if I spend too much time in an art museum, I start to go kind of stir crazy about it. I think I was in the Louvre for 6 hours, and at the end of that 6 hours, I never wanted to see a painting again. And we went to like the Versailles after that, and there were paintings on the wall. I said, I'm not looking at those things. It was my protest against seeing too many paintings at one time. So not very good at it. But here's what I want to tell you. The models of European art, models for American art were European, so they looked to the Europeans for whatever they were doing. It makes sense, they're coming from Europe, so the models of expression would have been European. But the Americans could never quite live up to them, and the problem was that they're a new society, there's not a tremendous amount of wealth, they don't have enough money to supply professional painters and things like that, so it's always going to be something less than that. Whatever the Europeans are doing at the height of their expression, the Americans are going to be somewhat less than that. Right? And what we see in America in terms of painting are called American primitives today. That's what we call them, American primitives. And so they're just, Americans who are painters, amateur painters, and doing their fun little thing. And oftentimes, from our point of view, I'm enough of an art appreciator to know what's kind of like good and what's not necessarily so good. And what's not good, of course, is disproportionality in terms of the painting. One person is this big, and the other person right next to them is that big, and it's not kids, those kind of issues. And that's what you see in these paintings. But intriguingly, because they're colonial Americans, they are perceived as extremely collectible. These things go for tens of thousands of dollars from the antique market. So if you have one of them, give it to me because it's worthless. Okay, I'll take care of it for you. Anyway, so it's artistic expression, but amateurish artistic expression. That's the best, almost the best the Americans could do. Having said that, I do want you to know that there were some world-class painters who came out of America. Believe it or not, they did. And just a couple of them I'm aware of. One was Benjamin West. Benjamin West was born and raised in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and really developed for himself extraordinary skill and ability in terms of painting. But he kind of tells the problem. He did not stay in the colonies. He really wanted to pursue his passion and his profession. So can you guess what he had to do? Well, you got to go back to Europe. Europe's where it's happening. And if you look at his paintings, he's very, very good. To me, it's a little too romanticized kind of thing that he would do. It's just my little weird thing on that, but I can tell that he's very talented, no doubt about that. Okay, and he's going to have some famous American paintings too, including like the death of General Wolfe was one of the ones that he did. I'll tell you later about General Wolfe. The guy who stayed home that I always want to mention was a man by the name of John Singleton Copley. John Singleton Copley. And the reason I kind of appreciate this individual was that he is the man who kind of gives us our images of the founding fathers often. He was a painter who did portraits in those days. And so when I'm thinking of John Adams or Benjamin Franklin or whoever, I think we're often seeing it through the eyes of John Singleton Copley. He's going to give us some of these. There's another guy, I can't remember his name too, but anyway, there were some very good painters in America, but this was the exception that proved the rule. Most Americans were relatively amateurish in what they would be doing. And what this really means is that Americans just didn't have time or money or the foundation for fine art. So instead, in art, they focused on craft. This was their thing. So help me out. What's the difference between art and craft?
Art is more painting, while craft is more building. Yeah.
Okay, that's not bad, but when you say building, we could build a statue. That's fine art.
Craft is useful.
Okay, craft has a utilitarian component to it. Fine art, you put it up on the wall and you just look at it and everybody goes, that's really beautiful. Okay, or it's a statue, we just look at it, we're not going to do anything with it. Craft could be like a quilt, and you still want to put the quilt on the wall because it's so damn beautiful, but if it's cold, you can wrap up in that sucker if you need to. The Americans wanted to be artistic in expression, but they didn't have the time to do it like in a fine art, wordless kind of way. So instead, and that was a really harsh statement for fine art, but without the value to the society kind of way. But instead, that they were willing to work in craft. And so their sewing was incredible, their quilts were beautiful, the blacksmiths did all kinds of wonderful things with metal that they would do. They would do designs on the hinges and make the door handle have a face on it. It actually comes kind of creepy when you think about it like that, Scrooge or something like that. But if that face started to talk to you, going, oh crap, I'm in for it tonight. Anyway, they're the guys who built the fireplaces and did the mantles around them, and the architectural entryway to the homes were beautiful, and their furniture was exquisite. These guys were incredible. Remember that there are no nails in their furniture at all, tongue and groove and peg, and oh my God, these guys were incredible. And by the way, that stuff is incredibly valuable in collectibles. We're talking up, that can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for this kind of stuff if you have a really fine piece of American colonial furniture. Anyway, this is what I have to say, of course, like silversmiths, like Paul Revere, it's a tea service, but it's incredible tea service, right? That guy really spent a lot of time and shaped that into something that's just sort of a gorgeous kind of thing. So the Americans, when they did their art, they tended to focus more on the craft manifestation of artistic expression than the fine art manifestation, which was just a little bit beyond their ken. It kind of works the same with music. So the models were European, so what they're trying to do, and again, I'm going to fail you guys in this, I don't know what, orchestrations and operas and stuff like that, symphonies, and it's Beethoven and Bach and whoever, Mozart, etc. I don't even know the time, or, that kind of stuff around that time, But in America, they didn't have the money to commission those composers. They didn't have the money or the time to create professional musicians who were just musicians and nothing else, And so American music was amateur music. And some of them were incredibly good. They could get together and they could do a duet, and they could do a minuet, and they could do a quartet, or something else that ends with these et statements. It's me showing my incredible knowledge of these kind of things, right? So they could probably put together some kind of a amateur orchestra and put on a really good show, but that was never going to be their business. Their profession was to do whatever it was that they did to continue functioning within the colony. So you have a similar kind of activity. There is music in the colonies, but the music is not professional music. Instead, they're going to kind of do like craft. They focus on folk. Folk music has a legal, right, this will stand up in a court of law, a technical definition, and it's kind of got messed with today because in the 20th century, of course, there began to be professional folk musicians like Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, etc. These guys are professionals, right? So they're very, very good. But what it really means is it's the music of the people, non-professional, amateur people expressing themselves in a musical kind of way. And of course, I could tell you about this, or I could try to perform something for you from Colonial America for you guys. That's what I'm going to do here. I want you to be very sympathetic to my cause right now because I both have a cold and my fingers are stiffer than they used to be. I'm setting it up. That's what I'm doing. I'm going to set it up for failure, okay? I did such a good job of setting up for failure last on my class. My 101 on Monday, Wednesday, they didn't even applaud for me afterwards, so this is going to be bad. You don't have to applaud. Of course, I'll flunk you off you. There we go. Yeah, I should. Oh, come on. Oh, great. Now I feel like my nose is running and. Okay. We'll do this, all right? So I do my pre-guitar jokes for you guys. So traditionally, this is what I would do. The first time I played guitar for the class, I would say something like, 2 rules when I play guitar in the classroom. Number 1 is if it's so bad that it really embarrasses you, you're welcome to leave the room, okay? Have you ever been in a situation where like the performance was really that bad that it was like, oh, I can't stand this kind of thing, I gotta get out of here. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is don't forget that I'm the person who grades you, okay? All right, so I've got 2 songs for I'll try to get through. The first one is called the Golden Vanity. And this will just be a folk song sung by Americans. And this actually is sung at the time of like Jamestown, so it goes way back. And the root of the song is actually the Spanish Armada. It's an English ship. It's out in the Lowland Sea, which is the English Channel area, kind of towards Holland. And there's a Spanish ship that's the enemy, and of course they're having to confront that. And I hope you guys know that this, of course, is a song that was written in the 1500s, so it's not like rock and roll or anything like that. And what they would do is have a story song that was kind of a ballad or something like that. And tell their story. I'd love to hear how they sing it. I'm sure it was really, kind of this kind of style that I cannot do. But the Americans liked the story because it was sort of the heroic underclass expression, and the bad guy in the story is the elite member of the elite, the captain of this particular ship. So here we go. I will try to get through it for you guys. I'm doing that chord all right. Feeling good about that chord. Well, there was a lofty ship, and it sailed upon the sea, and the name of the ship was the Golden Vanity, and she feared she would be taken by the Spanish enemy as she sailed upon the lowland, lowland, low, as she sailed upon the lowland sea. When up jumped the cabin boy, the age of 12 and 3, and he said to the captain, "What will you give to me if I swim along the side of the Spanish enemy, and I sink her in the lowland, lowland, low, and I sink her in the lowland sea?" "Well, I will give you silver, and I will give you gold, and my own fair daughter, your bonny bride will be, if you swim along the side of the Spanish enemy, and you sink her in the lowland, lowland, low, and you sink her in the lowland sea." Well, the boy made ready, and overboard jumped he, and he swam on the side of the Spanish enemy, and with his bore and auger he drilled holes 3, and he sank her in the lowland, lowland, low, and he sank her in the lowland sea. Well, quickly he swam back to the cheering of the crew, but the captain would not heed him, for his promise he did rue, and he scorned the boy's entreaties as loudly he did sue, and he left him in the lowland, lowland, low, and he left him in the lowland sea. Well, the boy turned around, and he swam to the port side, and up to his messmates full bitterly he cried, "Oh, messmates, lift me up, 'cause I'm drifting on the tide, and I'm sinking in the lowland, lowland, low, and I'm sinking in the lowland sea." Well, his messmates drew him up, but on the deck he died, and they wrapped him in his hammock, which was so long and wide, and they lowered him overboard, and he drifted on the tide, till he sank beneath the lowland, lowland, low, till he sank beneath the lowland sea. Come on! At some point it becomes sort of, patronizing. Okay, sorry. It'll look good on the tape though. Okay, a little more clapping next time. So this is actually, it's supposed to be a funny song, so I hope you'll hear some of the humor in it. The song was written by the Dutch in the settlement of New Amsterdam, and the only problem is whenever I sing it in Dutch, nobody gets the joke, so I'm going to sing in English for you guys. But it has a construct that I don't quite know how you describe it in music. I call it an add-on song, so you keep adding on to the song, and the only thing that I can think of as the equivalent is the 12 Days of Christmas. You guys know that one, of course. You just keep adding the first day, the second day, from 12 and all the way back down. So this song does the same kind of thing in a shorter construct, basically. But I don't want to do all of, I can't do all of them. It would take me forever. So I'm going to do the first two in the rhythm that it would be presented. Then we'll jump to the 12th Day of Christmas and just ram all the way back down to the Partridge in the Pear Tree kind of thing, all right? So you get it? Okay, so this is called When I First Came to This Land. And the story is about how, it's tough when you come to America, but it's also a good place, and hopefully you'll make it for yourself. When I first came to this land, I was not a wealthy man, but I got myself a farm, and I did what I could. And I called my farm the muscle in my arm, but the land was sweet and good, and I did what I could. When I first came to this land, I was not a wealthy man, but I got myself a shack, and I did what I could. And I call my shack, break my back, and I call my farm the muscle in my arm. But the land was sweet and good, and I did what I could. So you get the structure over there? So now we jump to the end. When I first came to this land, I was not a wealthy man, so I got myself a duck, and I did what I could. And I call my duck out of luck, and I call my cow no milk now, and I call my horse lame of course, and I call my son my work's done, and I call my wife run for your life, and I call my shack break my back, and I call my farm a muscle in my arm, and I call my class a pain in the. But the land was sweet and good, and I did what I could. There we go. I don't know where that last verse came from. I think that's a Freudian slip, isn't it? Or something like that. Really sorry about that. I'll have to edit that out. Just kidding. So they had their own songs. I'm going to sing you one more colonial American song, but I'm going to sing it in context. It's really cool when you can identify the song of the moment that was the most popular song in America. And so I'll do that when we get to that particular point. Anyway, so they had their music, but of course it was, as I effectively showed you, it was professional and amateur, or excuse me, non-professional and amateurish, right? I'm very good at being non-professional as far as music. Okay. A couple last things. One is literature. The Americans did have a little bit of literature going on, which I want to mention to you. That pen is absolutely dead. Not a lot of stuff going on here, because again, it takes time and kind of leisure time to develop these sort of things. So there's not I think there are some novels that are relatively poor in quality. There are some poetry, and some of the poetry actually is not so bad, of course, but it's kind of limited. The one thing that they wrote that became very popular, even outside of the colonies, was they wrote these capture narratives. So these were people that were captured by the Native Americans, who then somehow got away from Native Americans, and they would write their story out. And I don't know about you, but I actually would like to read that stuff. I mean, that's good stuff. Even today, like in literature classes, they do the captive narrative, because it's still something that's very interesting. And by the way, the captive narrative continues into the early part of the nation, too, because still people are being captured by Native Americans, having their interactions with them and all that kind of stuff. But here's the two areas which they tended to kind of excel in terms of writing, I should say, but not really literature. This should have been a literary. There we go. One thing that they wrote about was religion, and this is just something that the Puritans doing their thing. And the Puritan religious writing became very popular outside of the colonies, primarily in the Protestant realm, so in the Calvinist realm that they're going to want to read with the Puritans. They thought the Puritans were amazing, going to this new place, trying to create a city upon a hill, and they wanted to read that kind of stuff. And the other area of writing which the Americans excelled in, and they're going to, I hope you can guess it, they're going to write on something that they knew about more than anyone else in the entire world. And we're not too far from having discussed this in our class. What did they know about it more than anyone else in the entire world? It's inside of a sphere. They had political writing, so they knew about representative government. This was a big deal. So if you wanted to know about representative government, you kind of had to go to the Americans. They're the ones who were practicing it more than anyone else was. So a little bit of literary creativity here that I wanted you at least to be with. Not so much literature, but rather literary creativity. Okay. Now the real reason I do this cultural expression is just to tell you about one person, to be honest with you. What I'm going to tell you about right now is the person who really was the most famous colonial American by far. And not only was he known all throughout the colonies, and everyone would have known him, and pretty much everyone would have cherished him too. I mean, it's not just that they knew him. They really, really liked this guy and really admired him, essentially. But he was also increasingly sort of world-renowned, and that's problematic because he's not going to be known in China, but he was known in Europe, absolutely. And not only known, but honored. Honored by the kings of France and the kings of England, essentially. He was a man that was so famous that Voltaire was dying to meet him. You guys ever heard of Voltaire, one of the chief Enlightenment philosophers? He wanted to meet him, okay? So that's powerful stuff. And by the way, he wanted to meet Voltaire also, so that becomes part of the equation. But the most famous colonial American, and really just an incredible, exquisite expression of creativity as far as America is concerned in the colonial period. Guys, guess who I'm about to write on the board? Benjamin Franklin. Just an amazing guy. I have to tell you that, this is just my own little weird thing, but of all the historical characters in American history, if I could have lunch with one of them, it would be Benjamin Franklin, swear to God, The main reason I'm sure he'd be amusing, that he was funny. Just was a kind of this person that could really amuse everyone, just incredible kind of understanding of everything around him, just intellect, all of that was part of it too, an incredible kind of wit. And I just believe that if I had lunch with him, I would be incredibly entertained. I'd probably have a hard time laughing or eating because I'm laughing too hard and drinking. Hopefully I'd be drinking quite a bit, so I'd laugh even harder. But anyway, Benjamin Franklin just becomes this kind of exquisite example of creativity in terms of colonial America. So let me tell you a story, all right? And he's a potential identification. He was born in 1706 in Boston. And he was born to a poor candlestick maker. This was a man who spent his time wallowing in tallow. If you guys have any sense of tallow. But you know that lard is rendered pig fat? Well, tallow is rendered beef fat, all right? But tallow had usage. You could use it as the foundation for soap. You could make candles out of it. Indeed, the poor man's candles were made out of tallow. The rich man's candles are made out of wax. Wax was expensive and difficult, though. Tallow was cheap and abundant. The only good news about the tallow candlesticks were that if you were really, really hungry, you could eat them. It's pig fat, you could just eat your thing. Anyway, but his name was Josiah, was this relatively poor candlestick and soap maker, right? Now, Josiah would father 17 children. So can I hear an amen for unencumbered fecundity? Amen. Thank you very much. Kind of shows you these colonial families. 17 children. I need to let you guys know that it took him 2 wives to do that, right? He ran through one wife, she died, he runs through another wife. That's the part of it, that doesn't sound that good to me. Anyway, Benjamin Franklin was the 15th of 17 children. So he's way down the line, of course, and he had his mother, never even knew the first mother, of course, he was the second mother of Josiah. Anyway, the way that Josiah perceived him, though, becomes kind of important in the story. He was the 10th son. When we first kind of come across this, we only know that he's the 10th son. And it really pisses me off because it just ignores the sisters, right? Well, where is he? So we have to kind of work to figure out he's the 15th in the whole line of it because he has older sisters and stuff like that. But Josiah Franklin was a devout Puritan. So he's very much, of course, in the old school mode of being a Puritan. And the Puritans believed in the tithing. You guys have heard of the tithing, I'm sure, before. It's the giving of the 10th of your income to the church, because it's just a demonstration of your faith. And so the way that Josiah saw Benjamin was that he was the tithing. So Benjamin should be given to the church. So he wanted his son to become a minister, a Puritan minister. That was what he was absolutely hoping for when Benjamin was born. And the good news for Benjamin was that it made his father kind of want to focus on his education a little bit more, right? Got to create a foundation so maybe he could become a minister in the long run. But I bet you guys know that this is not going to work out, right? Because Benjamin Franklin is not going to go that particular way. And not only will he not become a minister, but you could argue that he wasn't necessarily even a Christian by the time he reached his adult status. I don't know if you guys know this about Benjamin Franklin, but he was very much the Enlightenment thinker, and so he accepted this concept that they call deism. And deism is a belief in God, but a rejection of religion. I'm kind of mixing science and God together. God is the supreme intelligence who created this incredible mathematically defined universe, and then just pretty much, oftentimes they would use the image of the clockmaker, wound the clock up, and then let it go of its own, and just simply allow the human beings to determine their own moral foundation, and that they will make a good world for themselves, using their reason, using the benign nature of nature, all this kind of stuff. So, don't worry about this too much, but I just find it's ironic, right, that Josiah wanted him to be a devout Puritan, and instead he becomes a deist, which is a very different kind of thing.
What's a deist?
What is it?
It was a belief in God and...
With God without religion. God is a creator, but just creating a perfect universe, and then humans are left on their own. So no intervention. And by the way, it was a criticism of religion, as you can imagine, right? Seeing religion as artificial, an artificial construct, seeing it as intolerant, of course, seeing it as a potentially violent and damaging to the well-being of people around the world. And, I don't want to be too cruel to religion, but historically those things are all kind of true one way or the other. But this was the attitude of that moment, right? But anyway, it doesn't work out the way Josiah wants to work out, right? Now, even in his youth, Benjamin Franklin proved to be something of a prodigy. Super smart, just picked up things very quickly. And a little bit of schooling, but he was what we call an autodidact. That means self-taught. He just could teach himself just about anything you can possibly imagine. So an incredible kind of intellectual prodigy in terms of even his youth, but also a physical prodigy too. I mean, he was kind of amazingly physically active also. And one of the hallmarks of that statement is that he taught himself how to swim. And he became an avid swimmer, and he swam all of his life. He just thought he saw it as one of the best ways to exercise, basically. And I want you guys to know that that's not as uncommon, not uncommon today, right? But in those days, amazingly uncommon, amazingly uncommon. Do you know that the British Navy did not even want their sailors to know how to swim? And I've always thought that that's just, they didn't even want them to know how to swim. Can you guess why they wouldn't want them to know how to swim?
They don't want them to jump out of the boat.
They don't want them to jump out of the boat, right, and just run away. But what's the more important thing? You would do, well, not so much go down with it, but you would do everything to keep it afloat, right? If you think you can manage yourself out in the water, then, once things get rough, you'll get out.
Okay.
But if you can't, you'll pump that thing until you drop dead, You'll stay with the ship until the last thing. So I always found that interesting, though. But they almost always had at least one or two guys on board who could swim, because, you need somebody, and it'd be really bad to be one of those two guys, because every time someone went overboard, Fred, go get him. Damn it, again. It's a storm. It's cold as hell out there. I don't want to go under. Anyway, you always have the couple swims. But Franklin, he swam the Charles River of Boston. He would swim later in the Scully Hill River and the Delaware River of Philadelphia. So, intellectual, physical thing going on there. All those are things I think are pretty admirable. At the age of, I think, 13, he was apprentice. If you're the son of a craftsman, you've got to be a craftsman yourself, essentially. So he was apprentice and didn't want to be a towel maker, and his dad didn't want him to get involved in that too. It's a messy business. So instead, he was apprenticed to his brother James to be a printer. You have to understand that when you have a family this big, that you have brothers and sisters that are, by the time he was 13, he had 30-plus-year-old brothers and sisters. James, I think, was like mid-30s at this time. Established businessman, had his own print shop. James was also a publisher of something called the New England Current, so he actually was a very successful man in his own right, essentially. And the dad said, take on Benjamin and let's see what he can do here. And so he was officially apprenticed to his brother, essentially. And, it was both really good because it taught Benjamin Franklin his original skill, which was as a printer, but it was also a problem because Benjamin was so damn good at whatever he tried to do. Printing in those days was very physical. It's a physical kind of thing. It's all about physical and dexterity. You guys know anything about those old printing press days? So you had to line up the print type, on a little block that you would do. I did this actually in a, what do you call that, graphic arts class in high school. It was really kind of fun to at least get a sense of it. And you had to go backwards, so you would start at the bottom and work your way back through it, so you start with a period and then the words. And of course, you're reaching into a thing, trying to grab lowercase letters, uppercase letters, space bars, punctuation bars, whatever, And if you make a mistake, it's really bad, right? Because you can't, sometimes you can just pull the case out or whatever it is, put something in for it, but oftentimes it would mess up everything. You'd have to kind of redo the whole thing. So it was all about quickness and dexterity, and before long, Ben was better than his brother. I mean, this guy's just a prodigy of whatever he tries to do. He's very good, and of course, it began to create a foundation of sibling rivalry, particularly with James. He also began to want to write and express himself. This is Franklin again. And he would ask James, could I write something for the journal? And James would just shoot down everything he even tried to do. Anything he tried to put forward, he's going to forget it. We're not going to do that, right? So he decided upon a subterfuge to get himself into print. And so he wrote these letters, a series of letters, and he used a pseudonym. You guys know the concept of the pseudonym. Pseudo is false, nym is name, false name, basically. And the false name that he used was Silence Do Good. And he portrayed the letter as if he was a woman, it's Silence Do Good, who has some interesting thoughts upon issues associated with Boston at that time. And he writes his little letters, and each one was, it would be pretty much the size of one typewritten page or something like that, all right? And he wrote them on a piece of paper, and he put them in an envelope, and he simply sealed the envelope, and he snuck it under the door of the print shop, so that when James walks in, he finds this little letter sitting on the floor. Well, James picks it up, reads it, and he's really impressed by this. He said, this is some really good stuff. So he prints the letter, and of course, Benjamin, you can imagine, sitting there, smiling, oh my God, look at this, Well, not only did he print the letter in the New England Current, but it became like the rage of the town. Everyone's talking about it. Who is this guy? What's going on? Who's doing this kind of thing? And Benjamin did a series of, I think, 6 of these letters, kept sneaking them in like that, right? And each time they came out, it was like even more sensational. I mean, he's 16 years old, and all the adults of Boston are talking about the stuff that he's written. And you guys know how it's going to work. He had to at some point. He wanted them to know he'd done it, right? You want to gain credit somewhere. Last week I was watching the tape before, but it was the thing on the Bronte sisters. The thing was called The Invisible Lives. These are these 3 sisters that lived in Yorkshire, something like that. And unknown to their father, their brother, anybody else, they wrote a series of novels, including Jane Eyre. You guys ever heard of Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights? And they're doing this all just kind of in secrecy. They're in tandem. They were working together. They knew what they were doing. But they're amazing. They were amazing what they could do. But but they didn't even want anyone to know, because they knew that if they knew they were women, they'd be shot down, that kind of thing. And plus they didn't want to just mess things up within the local community. In the end, though, you just want them to be recognized. And they finally did get recognition. And then they both died. Two of them died of tuberculosis. Damn, it's a hard life back in those days. That's all I can say. Anyway, Charlotte lived a little bit longer, and then she dies in childbirth. Come on, you guys, have better lives. I want a happy ending to my stories. Anyway, he wanted it to be known, and when it came out that it was him, James was not amused at all, and increasingly became like a toxic relationship between the two of them, to the point that it was fisting. I mean, these guys are fighting each other, tooth and nail, basically. And the problem for James was that by this time, Benjamin Franklin was bigger and stronger, and that's not going to go well for an older brother to be beaten up by his little brother. And finally, Benjamin decided this is no good. It's just not functioning here. So at the age of 17, he decides, this is 1 year after the whole do good letters, he had to leave. And he runs away from Boston, and he runs away from his apprenticeship and his dad, his parents, everything, the entire apparatus essentially. And he decides to go to the city that will become the base of operations for him for the rest of his life. Where's he going to go? From Boston to? Yesterday I really made a bad attempt at spelling Philadelphia, so I'm going to just say Philly for you guys here. Goes to Philadelphia. And from that point on, we really kind of associate Benjamin Franklin much more with Philadelphia, even though he was a native son of Boston. I have no doubt about that. When he left to go to Philadelphia, he's got this classic image, which he tells us about in his own autobiography. But he put all of his belongings like in a piece of cloth, and he pulled the cloth together at the edges and wrapped it, and then he stuck it on the end of a stick, which he then would carry like this on it. I swear to God, this is Benjamin Franklin walking away from Boston, creating the classic imagery of the runaway kid, which Norman Rockwell and others will redo time and time again. That's all we're really doing, is replicating what Benjamin Franklin did at that time. Well, he comes to Philadelphia with nothing. He's got nothing but the clothes on his back. Super smart, though, and he knew how to print, of course. I already told you that. And he lied. He told them that he was a journeyman printer. He wasn't, but he was talented enough to be a master printer, so what difference does it make? And pretty soon he simply begins his career in Philadelphia as a printer. So what I want to do is kind of go down through the list of the Benjamin Franklin did. He starts as a printer, and he was always, of course, very proud of that fact. And whenever he had to sign like a document that would include occupation, he would say, Benjamin Franklin, printer, even at the moment that he was the ambassador for the United States of America. And he put it at the top of the list of his activities in terms of his own headstone, too. He wanted this to be known. He was a printer. Of course, it was the foundation of his career. A printer, all they do, of course, is they simply take someone else's written word and they put it into print typewriter and they print it. If someone had really beautiful handwriting like me, I wouldn't need a printer. Of course, you guys know I would absolutely need a printer. But, either you did it by hand or you sent it to a printer. So a printer prints someone else's words. But he wanted to do more than that. He wanted to print his own words. And what we call that is a publisher. So he starts as a printer and then he moves to becoming a publisher. He will become famous with two very important periodicals as far as colonial America is concerned. And can anyone help me with either one of them? Because they are somewhat famous and known to people. One of them dealt with the weather. Is that going to help anybody? Okay. One was called Poor Richard's Almanack. So let me just tell you about Poor Richard's Almanack. Almanacs were, the word comes from Arabic. And the word in Arabic means the weather. And if you look at a lot of really important words about things like weather and ships and things, they come from the Islamic realm, because they were just doing it more effectively than the Europeans. So the almanacs were simply historical weather reports. So, what was the temperature on this particular day? What's the average temperature on this particular day? Sometimes when they do the news reports, of course, they'll say almanac data. So almanac data is the average high and the average low. And that's exactly what they would have included. With no weathermen and no other way to predict the weather other than just looking outside to see what the weather was all about, they often were dependent upon these almanacs. It gave them a historical record of the highs and lows. And the critical moment you need was the historical last day of frost or first day of frost or something like that, right? Or the rainfall totals for that particular time of that month for a plant. These are the kind of things that you needed. And so just about every American farmer bought an almanac. They would buy one. And the problem was that they were simply, it's just data. It's just page after page of the average temperature for every single day of the year. That's what you're going to present in the whole thing. But it was something that was necessary, so everyone had to buy one. Now the problem was, how do you make your almanac more, something more attractive than anyone else's almanac? And there were already a couple almanacs that were kind of on the market at that time, and Benjamin Franklin wanted to get in. So he tried to make it just a more interesting almanac than anyone else's. And he starts out by using, again, a pseudonym. So this is not Benjamin Franklin's almanac, it's poor Richard Saunders' almanac, and he portrayed himself as a poor farmer, just an average American farmer, but a very wise man with a lot of good things to say and something like that, who's going to present this, this kind of data. And what he put within the data, so just page after page, they just look like schedules, or something like that. With every page, he put little cute things in there to attract the reader and attract the attention. And among other things he put in there, he just put a whole bunch of little sayings that will become very famous in American history. Where's my book? That was a big setup for nothing. Okay, I didn't bring. Anyway, I remember some of them, so it's no big deal. I got a whole book of these sayings, and I'm sure you've heard some of them. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Fish and guests go bad after 3 days. Just one after another. There are literally hundreds of these things, okay? Some of them he gathered together. Many of them he created for himself, essentially, just to include. So as you're reading through the data, you're going to get to see, like in the margin, all these little things. They're kind of attracted to make you want to read. He also did kind of Dear Abby stuff, which I think those are the really fun ones. So he would write a letter. He writes it all. He writes a letter from the lovelorn. Someone's having this terrible problem with their husband or whatever, or this person that they're in love with, whatever. He'd write the letter, of course. And then he would write the response. So that allowed him to manipulate the entire thing, to make it amusing and humorous and have fun with it, that kind of stuff. And I think people really did just enjoy reading what was in the Almanac. But just to kind of show you his wit, on the very first edition of the Almanac, and what you would do is you'd publish it, and just once a year, right? Just publish, and you have to wait till the next year to do another one. But in the very first edition, he included an obituary for the person who published the most popular of all the almanacs in America. And of course, it was just a joke, right? The guy is perfectly alive, but he just thought it would be funny. I'm going to say, like, he's too bad that he died. That was a good almanac, but don't you worry. There's going to be that kind of thing, all right? And the guy was so pissed that he actually sued Franklin for libel for doing this. But I have to tell you, there was no case. It is not libelous to inadvertently proclaim someone dead. It didn't say, he said nothing bad about him. He said all these kind of nice things about him, actually, in the obituary and stuff. So intriguing, that didn't quite work out. And then in the next edition, so the next year, he said, I'm still feeling haunted by that guy that died, that didn't die last year, that guy. So he played with that kind of thing. Anyway, he made his almanac the most popular almanac in America. Everyone's going to turn to the sucker, of course, and the other guys their situation can be done. The other thing that he came up with, what time did that last time? Crap, I didn't quite get to it. It's the Pennsylvania Gazette, let me say it to you. Pennsylvania Gazette is America's first significant newspaper. It was just a weekly. You couldn't publish them more than a week. They were just so difficult to do, the technology, of course, printing. But it will be read not only in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, but all across the colonies. And it made him a very wealthy man and allowed him to do a lot of other really fun things. And I have to let you guys know, damn it. Anyway, have a nice day, and I will see you next time. All right. So for me, as much as for you guys to just regenerate what we're doing right now, if you guys remember when they got to the year 1900, Americans took a look at themselves, and though in many ways they were looking very good, of course the nation was becoming increasingly wealthy, incredible products, incredible technology, the city's burgeoning a magnet to the world, Americans were feeling kind of bad about America for a variety of reasons. And we look under kind of everything that was going on in America. We see the rise of big business manifesting in horizontal integration, trusts and monopolies, of course, able to pretty much do whatever they wanted to do. We see the workers grotesquely unhappy as they're transitioning into the Industrial Revolution and striking almost, it seems like, every single day, basically, because of some level of unhappiness. We see the cities, of course, amazing from the outside, but inside of them, they are crowded, congested, polluted, crime-ridden, tough places to live, basically. We see the confusion of culture and the babble of tongues as all these immigrants come. By the time we get to World War I, it's 15% of all Americans are foreign-born. So it's a really high time of the relative population of foreign-born in America, causing its own kind of intrigue and confusion for America. And on top of all of that, there's a tremendous amount of political corruption. Okay, so it's like, that's the cherry on top of all these other issues. And so the middle class, feeling America more than anyone else, began to respond to this situation. They believed in progress, of course. They believed in science as a methodology to promote that, and they began to call themselves the progressives. They were motivated by altruism, but also by a desire to reshape America in their own image, to create kind of a middle-class America where they would feel comfortable in living in this situation. And they began to commence what is one of the greatest reform movements in American history. I mean, I have to tell you, this is probably the greatest reform movement, really trying to hit the problems of America in a powerful kind of way, to transform America, to make it a better general place to live. And as I told you, of course, I have to at least mention that other source of the reform impulse. Remember, the new universities start to crank out the graduates right about the turn of the century, so they're part of the equation, really trying to mobilize America for reform and change. The reformers come in many packages. We see individuals like Jane Addams, of course, social welfare, in the area of social welfare, Margaret Sanger doing her important activities in terms of birth control. The journalists become muckrakers, right, who try and expose the evils of America, the scandals of big business, the scandals of politics, the scandals of labor, et cetera, and really do mobilize the American people. But finally, the Americans decide that they have to use the governing apparatus to really get change in America. So they start with the cities, remember, trying to clean up the politics through the city manager, city commission. They began to clean up, that was the government, clean up politics through taking over the voting structure, voter registration, moving the polling places to less corrupt locations, and then the secret ballot, which was really the death knell, essentially, of political corruption in terms of voter fraud, and doing all those kind of things. They also did social welfare, trying to help the kids, child labor issues, factory safety issues, things like this, of course. But remember, they ran into the wall of the corporate power in America, and they really couldn't impact in any kind of way. So that meant the progressives began to gravitate to the state level, and when they do so, that's a revolution in government. They go from the generalized notion of laissez-faire, leave it alone, right, to the increasingly interventionist and regulatory state beginning to emerge and begin to do things on the state level. And remember that, of course, I also want you to know that as the governments became more powerful on the state level, they also increased the relative democracy of America, giving people the right to choose their candidates in the primaries, choose their senators, the direct election of senators, initiative referendum recall, votes for women, all these things that will ultimately become, of course, a component of an increasing democratic America. But they also try to regulate big business, child labor, factory safety laws, et cetera, and they run into, again, the wall of corporate power. So the ultimate gravitation is to the federal government, and the federal government will become the ultimate expression of the progressive era. And as we move to the government, although it's really important that, the members of the House of Representatives were progressives and there were progressive senators, the story really is of the presidents. It's the era of the progressive presidents, and it's a transitional moment as far as the American presidency is concerned. And I can't remember how far I got, but I told you the president at the very beginning of the story was, at this moment, is William McKinley, but he's laissez-faire, conservative Republican. He's not going to have anything to do with the progressive era, but don't worry. Sadly for him, he's going to be assassinated, of course, by Leon Zolgost. And stepping into his shoes then is the youngest man ever to become president, dynamic, interesting, of course, attractive to the American people. He came to the White House as a young man with a large family. I think there were 6 kids under the age of 16. Alice, his oldest daughter, always causing problems in one way or the other. She'd smoke out. She would step out through the window to sneak out to smoke dope. Mess that sentence up just tragically. I don't know if she actually smoked dope, but she probably went out and drank with her friends. I mean, she was a pretty wild child. What can I say? But did I tell you anything about the kids? They lit off a cannon inside the White House. They put live animals into just all kinds of fun stuff. And the American people kind of fall in love with this guy. What can I say? The dynamism, the youthfulness of the whole situation. And he's going to become the first of the great progressive presidents. And really, he's going to do tremendous things it makes it correct that his face is up there at Mount Rushmore. He's a very, very important American president, okay? Not to mention just a crazy guy. What can I say? All the weirdness of the Roosevelt family is just amazing. It's like so deep you can't believe it. But anyway, he's going to become the first of the great progressive presidents. As he takes over in 1901, he makes statements, to let everyone know that he's going to be different than what had been before. He said the 20th century is going to be different, and so the government needs to be different also. And he described the 20th century as a century of big units. There's big, powerful entities in America. And he talked about big business, and you guys all know that's legit, right? But then he also talked about big labor, and I'm going, big what? That's not really big, but maybe someday it will become big. But he said, someone's got to be there to protect the people. Someone's got to protect the citizen, the consumer, the worker, someone's got to speak softly but carry, did I do this with you? Carry a big stick, right? That's not exactly the place that he used it, but that was kind of the imagery that he wanted. He wanted to be the great equalizer, the person who made things fair for Americans. When he finally ran for president, his slogan was the square deal, the square deal. Now that doesn't mean much to us, but in those days, square was like fairness, It's like having a square meal or something like that. It's a good meal. It's a fair meal for anybody to have a square meal. So he wanted the square deal. He wanted everyone to have a good deal as far as America was concerned, essentially. And by the way, because he used that square deal, his relative, Franklin, will call his program the New Deal. It's going to be a new deal for America in the 1930s. But anyway, he begins to mobilize himself, of course, and he begins to act. And he did a lot of things. Teddy Roosevelt's a complex character who was president for a good long period of time, of course. He did so much. But what I need to do is focus your attention on just what I think are the three most important things that were done by Teddy Roosevelt. So let's just look at those particular things. And here we go. The first thing he's going to do in an aggressive kind of way is to try to tame big business. I'm going to just call it taming big business. It's interesting that Roosevelt was a wealthy man. He's a rich person, okay, but he was old wealth in America. And I have a feeling that he kind of looked at the new wealth of these aggressive capitalists and industrialists, that they were kind of a different and somewhat lesser group of people, and too aggressive in their behaviors and doing things that were problematic as far as the nation was concerned. And he actually knew these guys personally. I mean, he went camping with Henry Ford. He would have time and spent with Edison. He knew these guys. He knew the people that were part of the kind of business arrangements in America. But he didn't like the dynamics of big business in America. He didn't like the way that it was behaving. He thought it was problematic. So he basically said, I'm going to tame it. We're going to cut down the relative power of big business in a variety of ways. Now, one way I just want to mention, I hope I can do it quickly for you because I want to focus on the other one. But he took something called the ICC, and this is an organization founded somewhat earlier. It's the Interstate Commerce Commission. And what he did was he used it to regulate what we call natural monopolies. If you guys know, but there are what we call natural monopolies that are just kind of part of the world that we have to live in. So a natural monopoly at your home would be the electric company. You guys know that you do not get choices over the electric company. There's only one electric company. It wouldn't make sense for two companies to put two sets of power lines to your house when you're only going to use one, right? So that's one of them. In the good old days, the phone was exactly the same. Now it's totally different, right? Okay, but in the good old days of the landline, you pretty much had one choice, and that was the way that was going to work out. And if you do have a landline, I still think you have just one choice, right? Those are natural monopolies. I can't think of. I guess the gas company's a natural monopoly. That would be one. One was the railroads too. Railroads in competitive environments or in large cities were competitive, but railroads in small towns, there usually wasn't like more than one railroad in a town, and so the railroad had an absolute monopoly over that town. And I don't know if you guys know what you can do when you have a monopoly. You can charge whatever price you want, right? Because there's no other service in town. You're the only service in town. And of course, Roosevelt looked at this stuff and he said, this isn't quite legit. We need to worry about this kind of situation. So through the ICC, he began to kind of force these natural monopolies to behave themselves. And what happened was, he called for the government to look in, intervene, of course, and regulate these particular areas. And for the first time ever, for instance, the ICC demanded to see the books of these companies to find out what they were really doing in terms of business. That's quite an intervention, to say the least. Have the private company open its books to you. But I'm just going to jump to the end game for you guys. You probably know that whenever a utility wants to raise the rates, and of course they want to raise them routinely, right? They can't just do it because they want to. That's not the way it works at all. They have to go to a commission, a public commission, to find out if that's going to be okay. They have to state their case to that commission. And on the day that they state their case to the commission, the commission is going to allow for a public audience to come to listen, right? So you and I, the people that are part of that utility, we get to go and we get to just scream bloody murder, right? Oh my God, they can't raise the rates on us. They're already screwing it, that kind of thing, right? It creates this kind of government intervention, which is an attempt to make sure that the natural monopolies are not going to go far beyond market in any kind of way and are going to be reasonable in the charges that they will do. And so this was done under the Roosevelt administration in the first instance. It continues in all of these natural monopolies to this day. It's that kind of significant intervention. The real action, though, of the taming of big business is something that evolved to become known as trust busting, and this is our potential identification. I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm going to say this anyway. That's the way I function with everything I've ever said in this classroom. I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm pretending like I am. I think this is the very first time the government did something that had kind of like a slogan to it, or something that was specially a word or a phrase that was made just for that activity. Later on, of course, there'll be the 1,000 points of light and the Great Society and this, that, and the other thing. I don't think there was anything like this before, though, because the government never did this kind of stuff before. And by the way, the government did not call it trust busting. The press did. But Teddy Roosevelt just said, hell yes, man, I love that. That sounds powerful, right? And I love the way the press portrayed him. They do the trust-busting political cartoons. And here's Teddy Roosevelt dressed like the knight in shining armor with his lance on his steed, and he's going to go out there and bust that trust up, Teddy Roosevelt was extraordinarily macho. He would have loved to have been like a Rambo character, you know, double bullet belts across your chest. I tried to do that on Halloween one time, but it really irritated my skin, so I couldn't go with that. Okay? But double bullet belts across your chest, and then 2 big machine guns just blowing the hell out of everybody. He would have loved that kind of imagery. But you know, he accepted it. He said, "Hell yes, this is what we're doing. We're trust busting." Okay. But what it meant was that he was going to bust up the most egregious examples of horizontal integration, trusts, and monopolies. He's going to go after their butts right, and he's going to break them up. And that's exactly what he did. Trust busting is a ultimately successful campaign. Now, as exciting as the campaign sounds, you know, trust busting is not that far from ghost busting. We all know how incredibly exciting that kind of thing is. It was an extraordinarily long-term and tedious operation. In fact, it was all litigation. Litigation means that it took place entirely within the courts. This is simply a courtroom activity. You know, they're going to sue the companies one way or the other. What Roosevelt did was he called up, when he starts the trust-busting campaign, he called up the Attorney General of the United States. Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the government of the United States of America. He said, "I want you to find every company or entity that is in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act." I mentioned this to you guys before. It was created in 1890, and it was a very weak and vague law, but it created at least a foundation for the potential of challenging these kind of entities. The one thing that the Sherman Antitrust Act said very specifically was it was a prohibition against any contracts and combinations that were in restraint of trade. So any entity that is restraining trade, what that would mean is you're controlling trade, inhibiting the process of the market, and any way you would do that, of course, that was illegal. And of course, there were many companies or entities that were doing exactly this. So Roosevelt says to the Attorney General, find everyone in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, take them to court, sue them, and bust their butts. Okay, that's exactly what the intention was. Now, it was not exciting, as you can imagine. This is courtroom activity. It was long, it was drawn out, it was tedious. The companies were very wealthy. They could afford incredible defense lawyers, right, to fight against it tooth and nail. And in the end, the entire process took 10 years. I mean, that just shows the power of the corporation, right? They can challenge the federal government, and they can fight tooth and nail for a long time. And by the way, it was not done until Teddy Roosevelt was no longer president. He's gone by the time this sucker is done. It's done in 1911, essentially. Anyway, so just a long, tedious thing. But in the end, it was effective. You know, they proved their points in these courts, and these companies were broken. In the end, some 42 trusts and monopolies were busted. And of course, you know, to add drama to the story, I'm going to tell you who was busted, at least some of the highlights of the busting that would take place. One company that you have not heard of was called the Northern Securities Company. Northern Securities is something you haven't heard, and it doesn't tell you anything about what it is. I love that. That's the kind of company, what is it? You know? But here, you know who owned this company. You've heard this before. His name was J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was like the classic, original corporate rating individual, you know, just a shark, essentially, economic shark, willing to break companies, make companies, do whatever it was. You know, just the art of the deal was essentially his realm of existence. And as a result, he made himself one of the wealthiest men, not only in the United States of America, but in the entire world. Now, forgive me for telling you this, but this is the kind of thing this is like a disease that I have that I cannot help myself from. So I'm in therapy, I'm trying to overcome it, but I just can't. Okay, got to tell you something about J.P. Morgan that I find very interesting, and that was that he had a huge nose, absolutely monstrous-sized nose. His nose was like Karl Malden, W.C. Fields' Craters of the Moon, big monster of a nose. And he actually was very embarrassed by that nose. It was just so big that it kind of bothered him all the time. And he would not allow anyone to take his picture that was not an authorized photograph, because if he could control the lighting and all everything, it may not look quite so bad. And the irony of the whole story to me is that if he lived today, it wouldn't be a deal. I mean, he'd be Michael Jacksoning his nose down or something like that. I mean, the nose would be gone. Anyway, but any paparazzi who tried to take a picture of him, I mean, he had big thugs, and they were not only going to break the camera, they're going to break the dude. I mean, these guys were mean and tough, and the law was not going to protect them in any kind of way, you know. There are a couple guys who got snapshots of it, you can imagine. There's always going to be the sneaky guy who gets it, you know. And there's sometimes when, apparently, he kind of knew that they were trying to take his picture, so he's putting his hand like this, but it's still sticking out. So I'm just kidding, making a joke out of that, but it doesn't. Anyway, did it work at all? I'll be able to see it on the film. That does not work, correct? Do not ever do that again. Anyway, but huge nose. I'm sorry, I have to. It's like the biggest nose in American history, so I got to tell you that. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't. Anyway, J.P. Morgan had created this company, and of course, what is it? I'm going to tell you now. He created a monopoly of the railroads of the northeastern part of the United States. So that's a railroad company, believe it or not. He owned all the railroads between Boston and Chicago to New York. You guys all know that that's like a center point of the American activity. I mean, it's huge in that area. And they simply decided that this could not happen. He cannot own all these railroads. So he was busted up as far as the trust busting. They also busted the American Tobacco Company. You guys remember who owned that?
J.B. Duke.
There we go, J.P. Duke. And when they broke it up, they broke it into 7 distinct companies. Shows you how big it was, right? You could break it up, and yet you still had some fairly substantial companies as a result of this, right? But, always save the best for last. The greatest trust or monopoly broken up by Teddy Roosevelt's trust busting was Standard Oil. We went after Standard Oil. Here's the thing I need you to know about Standard Oil. When they broke it up, it was, I think it's 24 companies. I mean, it broke up into 24 or more companies. I've heard that there might have even been more companies that came out of this thing. And by the way, every single one of the broken up companies was a substantial company, So it's not like you're breaking up into little teeny pieces. You're breaking it up into some fairly substantial entities. Now, I was always just interested in what happened to the Standard Oil Company. And I kind of found out what happened to it just by inadvertently in many ways. In 1981, I'd been married for a year, and I decided, my wife and I, we wanted to take a trip all the way across the country. So we go all the way to Maine and back, We just had a little truck, we tent camped the entire way. It was really kind of fun. Anyway, I wanted to have a gas card that would allow me to go, so I didn't always have to have cash for gas. And I got something called the Chevron travel card. That's one thing they had in those days. But the Chevron travel card allowed you to get a different station in every single state in America. And all I had to do was flip over to the back when I got to that state and look which one I could go to that state, And what I realized later was what I was doing was I'm looking at the breakup of the Standard Oil Company. That's what you're seeing on the back of the Chevron card. Chevron was part of the Standard Oil Company. I mean, just let you guys right know. In Nebraska, it was the Standard Company. In Ohio, it was Sohio. It was Esso in one place. It was Exxon in another. So, these are big companies that have come out of this situation. But anyway, when they broke it up, they broke it into very substantial companies, of course. It just shows you how big the Standard Oil was. And these companies will continue to be powers in their own particular kind of way. Okay, before I go a step further, I need you guys to know something. Don't feel sorry at all for the monopolists or the trust people, okay? Because they're not going to lose a damn thing. The United States did not believe in trusts or monopolies, but we did not believe in the confiscation of wealth, So they're busting the company, but they're not depriving the individuals of the wealth that they would have. So the point I want you to know is that they had to pay the owners of these companies face value for these companies. They had to pay them. If you're going to get a piece of that pie, you're going to have to pay the Rockefellers one way or the other. And indeed, the Rockefellers made so much money. They made more money off the sale and breakup of their company in terms of cash than they had ever seen in their entire lives. I mean, just think about it. It's like selling Apple today or something like that, right? You're selling this huge corporation, which would have a higher value than the assessed value, of course, and because it's on the marketplace and everything like that. Amazing amounts of money. They could not, no one could afford to pay the Rockefellers in absolute cash, because it would be way too much money. So they allowed him to be the family, to be a minor stockholder in all. We're talking like a quarter, 25% of all these companies, So they still had their wealth spread throughout the entire structure, but they couldn't be in a leadership or dominating position. And the rest of it had to be paid to them in cash. So you feel sorry for the Rockefellers. It's like swimming in money, right? It's just, oh my God, they got so much. So what do? They didn't even know what to do with all the cash. So they invested in real estate, Rockefeller Center in New York City or something like that, or philanthropic activities. And it was the same thing for the Dukes. It's the same thing for J.P. Morgan. Don't feel sorry for these guys at all, okay? They're getting paid for everything that was essentially taken away from them. And indeed, all the trust busting really did. Invisible ink is fun. All it really did. Actually, with me, invisible ink is probably a better thing, isn't it? Then we can't know what's going to be up on the board. We can't even begin to guess what's up on the board. That's what we do. Reinforce the oligopoly. So it's the allowance. Roosevelt was fine with a few big companies, vertically integrated, taking over the entire plane of productivity, but he would not allow a monopoly or a trust organization to establish. And that's pretty much the way the United States will run from that time on. We cannot allow a monopoly, though we still can get them periodically, right? And sometimes it's part of the evolution of the process. So Microsoft was essentially a monopoly there for a while. I don't know if it still is. I don't think so anymore. but it was a time where it controlled well over 50% of the software in America, everyone. And of course, it was kind of it's a benign monopoly that does not really hurt the consumer, but it hurt the competition, right? They could just nail the competition, yes.
With like those natural monopolies, like with the gas and whatever, is there any kind of protocol or like restrictions placed on
Of
them
course.
so they don't take advantage?
I didn't really tell you, but there are going to be commissions that evaluate them. So those commissions are made up of members of the industry, but also politicians, and often, just experts in the field of that particular, college professors and stuff like that. So people that can be part of it, they'll look at the request. Sometimes the requests are legitimate. Now, you do have to increase you need a better facility or something like that. You have to pay for that somewhere or the other, so you might want to raise the rates for that. Routinely nowadays, because it is so restrictive, they've got to have a good reason, right? They can't just be pretending like we just want more money. That's never going to work, right? So you create a commission there, but plus, remember all the public input, so that people can talk about, they get to have their say in the whole thing too. So they kind of took it out of the closet where it could be controlled by the monopoly and put it into the public arena where we can all see exactly what's happening. So just make sure we're not getting screwed too much, okay? So anyway, the trust busting became the signature kind of activity of the Roosevelt administration as they attempted, as he did effectively, I think, tame big business in a fairly substantial way. Okay, the second thing that Roosevelt did, second major area of reform, was in the area of consumer protection. Let's keep it all right here. Okay. The Roosevelt administration will introduce a legacy of consumer protection, which as a consumer, of course, I'm going to be very positive towards, because I see this as something kind of elemental in offering protection for the individual Americans as consumers. But the Roosevelt administration will really begin the entire legacy of consumer protection. The origin of the consumer protection is a very specific kind of point, and it takes us back to the muckrakers, and it takes us to really the most famous and ultimately most effective of all the muckrakers. Someone who wrote something that will really transform America. And that's the thing, right? If you've done something like that, which really has a huge impact, then you have to look at yourself and go, wow, you did something. It's a big deal. Now, the individual who began the process of consumer protection, and part of the irony of the story was unintended, was a man by the name of Upton Sinclair. And I just want to give you a little bit on Upton Sinclair. I don't want to worry too much, but Sinclair was a socialist. He was an openly and avowed socialist. I want you guys to know that part of the story. I call him an idealistic socialist. I know that as Americans, our notion is always to turn against socialism. Like it's this terrible negative. And the reality is, I never see socialism as a viable alternative to capitalism. Capitalism is so incredibly strong that you just can't, there's nothing better than that, okay? The proof is in the pudding that a communist country like China is using capitalism to develop itself. I mean, come on, What would Marx do with that? I'd love to hear what Marx, I'd like you to talk about what's going on in China right now. Blow his brains out or something. Anyway, the most that you can ever say about socialism is a criticism of capitalism, and I think legitimate in many situations. It's an attempt to mitigate the worst excesses of capitalism. That's what they were trying to do. And what it has emerged is what we call mixed economies, where we have socialism and capitalism. And I was trying to measure it just in terms of like how much private sector economy is there and how much the government is in. Right now, our government's about 25% of GNP, and our private sector is 75% of GNP. And admittedly, that's the highest it's ever been. But it still means that 3/4 of our economy is private sector. Just 1/4 is the government, though it does have a tremendous impact with that 1/4 of that. But anyway, I don't want you to think of him as like a commie or something like that. He's pre-Russian Revolution, in terms of his thinking. He simply wanted there to be social and economic justice and equality. That's what he wanted, And his chief concern were the workers of America. That's often what the socialists focused on, right? And the abuses that they had suffered under the industrial regime. And he was hoping that he could do something to help them. That's all he's trying to do. It's idealistic socialist trying to uplift the well-being of the workers as much as he could. A couple little things I just found interesting about him. He lived a lot of his life in California, so he lived in Pasadena, so almost our neighbor or something like that. He wrote 99 books across the course of his lifetime. Of course, that made him a failure because he couldn't reach 100. But this is the only one. He only wrote one that really became very powerful in any kind of way, and one of the first that he would write. But I always picture him sitting there in Pasadena, probably in a really nice craftsman house, writing books on whatever it was that he was writing about. But the book that he will write that will change everything, and this becomes the identification, of course, was something called The Jungle. And The Jungle was published in 1906. So let me tell you the story of The Jungle. The Jungle was a book that was written about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And the way that it's described in the book is it's called Packing Town. And I think that that was probably what the locals would call it, Packing Town. Packing Town was simply an area of Chicago. I've actually been through that area. Maybe you guys have been through there too. If you drive on the interstate that heads kind of south from the loop, straight south, I can't remember what interstate that is, but you go through the stockyards and all, just really noticeable because you're kind of in the density of the urban situation, and all of a sudden it kind of opens up. So it doesn't really open up because there's all these fences and gates and stuff like that to manage all the animals. And the meatpacking industry is all around the stockyards, and then all around that are the neighborhoods where the workers would live at that time. So that was described as Packing Town. So what Upton Sinclair decided to do was he wanted to investigate the nature of the immigrant labor in Packing Town. What was it like to be an immigrant working in the meatpacking industry? So he comes into this area. This would have been like 2 years before publication. And he simply lived in the area for 6 months. He just came into the area and he wanted to experience everything that he possibly could about it. Now, intriguingly, he went to the meatpackers and he said, can I see what you guys are doing? And they opened the doors wide to him. They wanted him to see whatever he wanted to see. It's kind of amazing. They just let him in there. Because generally they were very proud of what they were doing. They were vertically integrated, hyper-competitive, hyper-efficient. One of the meatpackers said, this was his claim to fame, the only thing that we don't use from the pig is the squeal. If they could use the squeal, they would have used the squeal too. I mean, these guys were incredibly efficient what they were doing. So they opened the doors wide to go to Upton Sinclair. He got to see every damn thing you can possibly imagine, okay? So he does that. But he spends most of his time just with the workers, living with them, talking with them, observing their situation, trying to find out what their lives were like and all that kind of stuff. Well, he takes all of this stuff together and he packages in this novel. I need you to understand the novel issue. So this is a fictional work. It's a fictional work. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is the issue of liability. You guys understand what it might be doing here? So he's telling a true story, but he wants to present it as fiction. But he doesn't want to present it in a way, of course, that could lead him to some kind of serious lawsuit by one of these major companies that could nail him. So that's what you sometimes do. You present your story as a fictional account, and none of the people or the names represent anyone. Even though they absolutely do. I love that part of it. It's a way of protecting yourself in many ways. So he writes this novel called The Jungle. And before I go farther, I want to at least deal with the name. In the 19th century, actually before that, of course, the Europeans began to venture out around the world. And they went to places like Equatorial Africa, and they went to places like Amazonia, the Amazon River Valley, of course, in South America. And as they ventured into these realms, which were very different, of course, for them as far as Europeans were concerned in their temperate area, they called them jungles. Now, I want you guys to know that the jungle has no scientific legitimacy or meaning. That word means nothing in terms of science. It's just a created word, basically, by these people. They were going to the jungle. But here's the critical thing about the jungle. The word jungle was suggestive of danger. Jungles are dangerous places, right? When you venture into the jungle, there are all kinds of things that can get you. There are spiders the size of your hand that are just creepy crawling all over the place, right? There are snakes that are going to drop from the sky. I love that, right? It's hard enough seeing them when they're on the ground, when they're going to drop from the sky or something like that. There are bugs in there. Of course, the most dangerous bug, of course, is the mosquito, but there are others, leeches and fun stuff like that. Insects that will kind of burrow into your skin and plant their little larvae in there, and then it will grow up and it'll evolve. It'll come out of your arm, totally formed. Oh, how fun is that? I've got a weird bug coming out of my skin. You ever seen that kind of stuff? That is gross crap. That's the reason I'm not going to these places, okay? Anyway, there are places where you put your life at risk. There are places where you go to die. So you have to understand, he meant this and he wanted this to be very powerful. This is the jungle, a dangerous place where it can kill you, okay? That's exactly what he's trying to convey here. By the way, what is the scientific word to describe a jungle? What's it called scientifically?
Rainforest.
It's a rainforest. I love this. Like, we're going to go to the jungle. Oh, no, not the jungle. I'm scared of it. But then you say, we're going to go to the rainforest. I want to flit through the rainforest. I mean, it just sounds so different. Oh, let's go to the rainforest. That sounds fun, Jungle. Oh, damn, that's scary as hell. Anyway, but that's just the word to imply the danger of the situation. Okay, so here we go. Here's the story. Don't worry about taking all of it. Just get a little bit to get a sense. The novel focuses on two individuals, and these are Lithuanian immigrants. So they came from Lithuania, and apparently there was a lot of Lithuanian immigrants who come to Chicago this time. And their name was a young man by the name of Jurgis. That would have been George in English. And his pretty petite fiancée, Ona. The two of them soon to get married. And they come, and what's going to happen is that Sinclair's going to like focus all of these things that are happening that he's aware of on these two people, and in the end, it's just like a horrible tragedy for these two people. But they come to America. Jurgis is, big, strong, strapping young man. Ona's pretty and petite. The two of them are looking forward to a life together. They have relatives in Packingtown, so they can come there. They're going to make their way in America. It's going to be great. Okay, all those kind of hopes and dreams of the immigrant coming in their minds. Well, the first day, Jurgis goes to get a job, and of course, the place to go is the meatpacking industry. And Sinclair does this incredible job of doing these kind of verbal portraits when you're reading and you're just seeing it almost. And the meatpacking industry is all this monolithic big buildings that look kind of forbidding and all that kind of stuff. And all the men who are trying to go get jobs there, the people that are getting jobs, they're all these broken down people, just kind of making their way towards the factory, hoping they're going to get a job or something like that. And in the middle of this crowd, here's Jurgis. He's bright and shining and young and strong. And, the meat packers say, fresh meat, man, right there. And he gets a job the first day. Welcome to America. I got a job. How cool is that, okay? Anyway, he gets employed by the meatpacking company, but he's employed on the killing floor. He's sent to the killing floor. And the killing floor is literal as far as, of course, the meatpacking industry is concerned. This is where they kill the animals. The cows are brought in and killed, of course. The pigs are brought in and killed. It's a place where they are disemboweled, so you're going to disembowel them, of course, get the blood out of them. It's a place where they're going to be skinned, where the carcasses will begin to be managed and hung up so they'll begin to go through the processing part. Super difficult work, as you can imagine, large-scale things that you're having to lift, whatever. Very dangerous because, and again, Sinclair does such a good job of kind of just displaying it. In the summertime, the floor is just like 3 inches of blood and offal. You're just swimming through just the blood and guts of these animals, of course, because it's just dropping down on it as they're trying to pull it out of the animals one way or the other. And just pictures this extraordinary slippery kind of thing. And it was problematic, so they had to squeegee it. They would squeegee it into these big holes, and dump it down or whatever. And then he has to always give us the potential. Sometimes the guys would slip and fall down through the manhole. Sometimes they got him out. Sometimes they couldn't get him out. So they're going to go down there and die within that offal or something like that. In the wintertime, it turned into a bloody ice rink. It's all frozen. So you're just trying to make your way across all this frozen blood and guts and stuff like that to your job. And the whole notion is this is a man-breaking place to work. Right? This can break you. It can break you in a very serious kind of way. Not to mention just the lifting of these carcasses up onto the hooks and stuff like that. And Jurgis does a good job because he's a young, strong man. But one day he slips, he falls, he breaks his arm, and the second he broke his arm, he's done. Right? He's fired. He's out of there. And so he has to go home, and of course that means that Ona has to go to work because someone's got to help supply the family. And I can't tell you everything, but just the little things. They try to buy a house, and they get screwed in the buying of the house. They have a little baby, but the baby crawls off the front stoop and falls into the mud of the slimy streets of Packingtown and drowns or something like that. They've got a nephew, and he develops tuberculosis because he's having to be working cold all the time. All their friends' fingers are shrinking because they're cutting endlessly, and they keep nicking their own finger. And every time they nick their finger, it gets a little shorter and a little shorter. I mean, all this stuff is going on all the time. But Ona has to go to work, right? And so she's pretty, she's petite, she comes into to the factory. The foreman sees her on day one, and of course she's got a target as far as he's concerned. Pretty soon he's got her up against the wall. Pretty soon he's forcing himself upon, he's kissing her. And that's the breakup of that moment, and she goes, but she can't tell Jurgis because he's hurt, he can't come back to work. And of course the company's not going to do a damn thing, so she doesn't tell anybody. Well, she doesn't tell anybody, and so the next guy, the foreman, says she didn't tell anybody, this is open game or whatever. And pretty soon, as you can imagine, he's raping her. And I think, they take the story way too far. He later takes her down to the Loop and he pimps her as a prostitute, of course. And, I think ultimately she develops venereal disease, and that becomes the source of her ultimate death or untimely death or whatever. Anyway, one day, finally, Jurgis finds out what's happening. He goes ballistic, of course. Ona can no longer go to work because of that. He's got to go back, even though he's not fully recovered. And the only job that he'll give him as a semi-lame person is to work in the fertilizer part of the factory. It's like the end game of everything. And he notices when he walks in that there's like just stuff floating in the air that people are breathing. And everyone's skin has turned some kind of weird color like that. And after half an hour, he's puking his guts out. It's like just bad and whatever. But he can't do anything. He's got to keep a job. So he's working through this hell. Anyway, just one bad thing after another. And I have to just finish the story for you. Ona dies. The kids are dead, of course. Jurgis becomes a broken man. The alcoholic, turns to life of crime, gets thrown in jail, etc., etc. Anyway, end story, end pages of the book. Here's poor Jurgis. Remember how hopeful he was in the very beginning? He's just totally broken, wandering through the streets of Chicago, cold, frigid Chicago day. He's just looking for a place to try to warm up if he can. Sees a door open, kind of a warm glow coming from it, enters into this room, sort of a church-like situation, right? And there's a guy standing in the front of the dais, and he's preaching, and he sits down just to warm up, but he begins to listen. And what he's hearing is this guy's a socialist, right? He's telling you about the social millennium, the coming of change and the better. So that's the happy ending of the jungle, right? The socialism will be able to guide the people out of this. Okay. What Upton Sinclair will ultimately say was that he wrote The Jungle to hit the heart of America. He wanted them to understand the pain and suffering of the American worker and to do something about this horrible situation, okay? But as he will ruefully also say, he said, I aimed for the heart of America, but tragically, I hit them in the stomach. He did not hit them in the heart, he hit them in the stomach. Because as he was describing the poor suffering of Jurgis and Ona, he was also describing all the terrible things that he had seen in the meatpacking industry. And of course, that's what the middle class is going to ultimately pay attention to. I had to read this book as a sophomore in high school, and so I have read it, in case you guys were wondering. But the thing that cracked me up was that I became increasingly convinced that the teacher had us read that book because it has so much gross stuff in it. And she knew that we liked the gross stuff, and it was absolutely true. We would come to say, dude, did you read page 54? Oh my God, yeah, it made me puke. I mean, we liked that stuff. We're, oh my God, I can't believe what they're talking about here. Anyway, tragically for all of you, I have not really come out of adolescence in any significant kind of way. So I'm about to read from page 52 for you guys, if you don't mind. I printed it out for myself, so I wouldn't forget. I printed it and made it big letters. Go, here we go. So, and I love this line because, it just kind of says the whole thing. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. And you guys all know sausage is like a bad road to go on in the very beginning, so, okay, let's go down the road of sausage. They would come all the way back from Europe, old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white. It was dosed with borax glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There was meat that had tumbled on the floor, in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had trampled and spit uncounted billions of consumption germs. By the way, that's TB, in case you're wondering. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race out upon it, and a man could sweep his hand and pick up a handful of dried dung of rats. These rats were a nuisance, and the packers put poisoned bread out for them. And they would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. So, bon appetit, enjoy your sausage. The funny part of the story is that Teddy Roosevelt, the joke was, Teddy Roosevelt was reading this book while he's eating breakfast, and he loved sausage every morning for breakfast. And so he's reading the book, and all of a sudden he's spitting the sausage out and running to the White House, I've been poisoned. And then the end of the joke was, and that day, the president, like the rest of us, has become a vegetarian. I got a feeling that if we hung out in a meatpacking company, we would all turn into vegetarians relatively quickly. Anyway, Roosevelt was horrified by what he read. I mean, he couldn't believe it. So he calls on Sinclair to come to the White House. He demands that he comes to the White House, essentially. And he basically said, "No, are you telling the truth, young man? Is this?" And Sinclair said, "Man, I was there. I saw everything I'm telling you about. I saw it happen, essentially, And so, Roosevelt is offended. The nation was offended by this. And of course, it will lead them not to do a damn thing about the worker, but to begin to focus on the issues, of course, of consumer protection. Within months, just to let you know how fast it was, it did not take long at all. Within months, of course, Roosevelt is mobilizing, and he's going to use Congress. You have to use Congress to actually pass the laws. They will first pass the Meat Inspection Act. This is considered to be, so it's 1906, this is the first considered important consumer protection ever in the history of the United States. And what it calls for, and what it demands, is there be some evaluation, of course, of the meat that's being dealt with in the meatpacking industry. It's a relatively simple evaluation of federal inspectors that would go into the meatpacking industry. They were primarily required just to do two things. They were to look at it and to smell it. So it's a visual olfactory analysis of the meat. And you all know that that's pretty much what just the layperson does whenever they deal with meat. That's what I do as I'm a cook. When I'm buying, of course, first of all, I'm going to look at it in those two ways. Oftentimes you can't necessarily smell it if it's wrapped up or whatever, but you can look at it, of course. Anything that's any kind of a discoloration, I'm going to reject offhand right there, right? And then you take it home, of course, and if you look at it and if it looks bad, if it smells bad, it's the signal to reject, or in my case, to give it to my dogs. Hope you guys won't be mad at me for that. They don't seem to mind, though. They seem to be happy with whatever it is that they get. Anyway, so a visual and olfactory kind of evaluation, which is, that's all good, right, relative to what there had been before. There are some who claim today that we should have a biological assessment of meat, maybe in a random process, and that really peaked up about the time of the mad cow disease, which hopefully you guys don't even remember that, but that was kind of a scare that came in, kind of hit the British essentially. We actually went to England at that time, and I did not eat any beef in Great Britain. I probably was a safe time to eat it, but I just said, hell no, I don't want to mess with that kind of thing. It kind of gets into your brain and starts to eat away your blood. It's just a really bad outcome of all that. Anyway, but at least there was going to be some level of kind of inspection that would begin to occur. So it became really an important consumer protection. I do want you to know that the meatpacking industry did not protest this, right? This is a serious intervention into their area, but they realized that they had messed it up so bad. They got caught with their pants down, way down, and they realized it, so they had to fix it, right? So they embraced the reform. They actually accept the reform and embrace it, and they kind of welcome the inspectors that will come and make sure that everything is on the up and up. And then I love how the entrepreneurial spirit of America, they take it from being like a criticism to making it become part of their advertising. That the beef that we sell from our company is USDA, AAA, government-inspected beef. They're going to use that device as the way they're going to actually sell the meat to the consumer altogether. So this comes along and, of course, presents itself as a critical improvement. And you got to understand, the jungle was killing people. It was sending meat out there that was killing people. So this is clearly, an advance, to say the least, all right? Now, the second they did the Meat Inspection Act, they began to think that there are other potential areas, of course, of abuse here. So they're going to pass just a little bit later something called the Pure Food and Drug Act. Of 1906. Just two areas I want to highlight for you. First was drugs. I don't know if you guys have any sense of medicine in those days, but medicine was not a medical and scientific thing in those days. It was primarily just an entrepreneurial activity. So that meant that people were making medicines. We call it the heyday of the patent medicine. So just create a medicine and sell the medicine. I don't want you to think that there weren't any people who were trying to get real medicines. There were people that were doing that, but the realm was invaded by the entrepreneurs who simply saw a lot of money to be made. And so what they would try to do is put together some kind of concoction, of course, that they could market, that they could sell, and they aggressively sold these things. Sometimes we call them fish oils or whatever, snake oils, the word that they would use in those days. And the image that I have is like coming into the western town, you got your wagon and all kind of stuff, and you open up the wagon to become like a stage with a backdrop on the thing, and you're going to sell, your perfect elixir, whatever it is that you're going to sell. And you'd have shills in the crowd, and they'd walk up on crutches and take ones, and they'd be able to, I can walk now, or a blind person, I can see, after taking one drink or whatever, just trying to promote. And all they were interested, of course, is selling it for $1 a bottle. If they could do that, that's what they were making money on. Now, when they did this, they had to guarantee that there was some medicinal quality to it. So what they needed was that it not to taste too good. You all know that you don't really want it in medicine. If medicine tastes too good, you're like, this isn't medicine, this is something else. And by the way, that has some interesting outcomes too. A man by the name of Pemberton, a doctor by the name of Pemberton in Georgia, was concocting something in his backyard, put it all together, and he really decided that it had no medicinal qualities, but he thought it tasted really good. So he took it to a local drugstore, and the guy carbonated it and began to sell it. And one day some traveling salesman comes through town, and they're drinking, damn, this is good. We got to bottle this sucker. And you guys know what that became? Coca-Cola came out of this kind of milieu. I have a feeling that it's the same like Dr. Pepper. It sounds like it, right? Even 7-Up, people believe that that's kind of medicinal and it has some qualities in that particular kind of direction. But anyway, at least this Pemberton wasn't trying to cheat anybody, right? He realized no medicinal qualities. Though it did have a little bit of cocaine in it in the very beginning. So when you needed your Coke, you really needed your Coke. Kind of serious thing. Anyway, you wanted it not to taste too good, but not too terrible, right? But the main thing you wanted it to have a kick. So that means when you drank some of that, you felt something. So can you guess the number one ingredient in the patent medicines of those days?
Alcohol.
Was alcohol. That's a way to make sure there's a kick. You're going to feel it. You're going to either feel it right away or you're going to feel it down the road. Something's kicking in here. And some of these medicines were like 40 proof. So they're not just a little bit of alcohol. They're primarily alcoholic, basically. And one of the saddest stories of this, middle-class women who did not drink alcohol at all, and yet they became addicted to their patent medicine, and they drank it every single day. And the part that bothers me is they don't even know they're drunks. They don't even know that they're an alcoholic. They're just thinking that I have to have my my elixir every single day. those patent medicines, they targeted women in association with their menstrual cycle. So this was something to deal with the cramps and other kind of things. And lots of middle-class women became addicts for this stuff. They couldn't stay, even when they weren't, of course, in that moment, they still wanted to drink their medicine one way or the other. Anyway, alcohol was, remember these are given to kids too, so you're giving them heavily laced alcoholic medicines. Another thing they used was opium. And of course, you guys all know that opium does have potential medicinal qualities to it. Opium will shut down your digestive system, which has led me to getting to know that if people are taking too many opiates, then they have opiate-induced constipation. I love the commercials of America today. It's so wonderful to get to know. Don't worry, my doctor gave me something to loosen me up. Oh, damn it, I'm feeling better about this all day. Anyway, opium was used, of course, and the one that really was bad in my mind was they used mercury, and you guys know that mercury is a dread poison. You're not supposed to mess with mercury in any kind of way. When I was a kid, of course, we didn't quite realize the dread poison, this nature of mercury. I remember this. This is 8th grade, and we broke a big laboratory thermometer in my science class, and so we're all there, picking up our little piece of mercury. And I remember just looking at mercury, just floating it around. Oh, this is so cool. I hope I didn't lick my hand, or I don't know what I did next. Feels funny. How does it taste? I don't know. So anyway, if I did taste it, I am still waiting to die. I've been waiting to die for a long time. Not exactly sure. It may be like emotional problems that are happening or something, because that's kind of happening for real, but I don't know. Anyhow, they're putting all these dangerous things, of course, and there began to be a notion that this should be dealt with in one way or the other. So what happens with the Pure Food and Drug Act is a number of things. Prohibitions against dangerous ingredients within drugs, that became part of it. But more importantly, they gave absolute control over drugs to the medical profession. They're allowing the doctors to control medicines from that point on. And as you can imagine, this was a huge power boost to doctors. All of a sudden, they're going to gain themselves a position. And of course, it creates the foundation of the drug industry, which was, the good news is, of course, more scientific and medicinal than in the good old days was, but the bad news is these guys are going to ride that sucker to as much wealth as they possibly can. No doubt about that. Anyway, they began to clean up the drug area. For other foods, they did similar kind of things. For the first time ever, there was a requirement of labeling. And I don't know how you guys feel about this stuff, but I think this is really, really just important stuff. Because as a consumer, I do not have enough time to spend, to find out what exactly is in every product that I've eaten. The tragedy of the story is that I probably had trans fats in my diet for a long time without even knowing what the hell a trans fat was. Who even knew what the damn thing was for a long time? And now we know, right? And now we know these are things that you should avoid. And, here's the little simple rule that I came across. I think it is smart, pretty intelligent. But if you're eating anything, it's probably got a sweetener. You need to have the protein and the fiber outnumber the sugar grams by a significant amount. So if you add them up and they're less than the sugar grams, that's not good food for you, right? But if you add them like you have 5 grams more of protein and fiber, then that's not so bad, right? If it's equal, they're telling you not to eat those kind of things, necessarily. That's something we wouldn't have known, right? Now we can look at that. We can look at how much protein it has, how much sugar it has, et cetera, how much fat, all those kind of things. Anyway, so this is a legacy of concern with the consumer that has begun at this time. And I'm sure you guys all know the 20th century will simply expand upon this, perhaps ad nauseum, maybe going too far. That's a question of our time, basically. But anyway, all of a sudden you have significant consumer protection. And of course, I'm not sure that Upton Sinclair celebrated that, right? Because that was never his intention. His intention was the worker, and the worker is totally ignored in the outcome of the whole thing. But the consumer will be protected. Okay, the last area of significant activity for Roosevelt, and the one I say for last because I like it the most, I guess, was in the area, I could have used 3 of those letters, all right? Conservation. You guys offended by having a green C? If I could do every other word a different color, that would be really cool, yeah.
Is this still part of the jungle?
No, we've moved on. So the 3 things of Roosevelt, number 1 was the trust busting, number 2 is the consumer protection, and number 3 is conservation. Conservation is going to evolve to be 2 identifications for you guys, so apologize for that. I will tell you actually what conservation is, that's its own thing, but I want to start by telling you the story of the emergence of conservation as a concept in America. And like other things that you read about in American history or find out about, there's sort of a founder of conservation. I'm going to call him a founding father. Jane Addams was a founding mother of social welfare in America. This man by the name of John Wesley Powell was the founding father of conservation. And I'm going to use him for our potential identification. I don't know if you guys remember, but I made that comment about the issue of heroes. I really believe here's another great American hero, John Wesley Powell, at least in my mind, and tremendously important. Founding father of the concept of conservation, critical idea for America in sustaining, of course, our natural resources. It has to be. And plus, just if you look at the activities of his life, you'll see he's heroic also, okay? He's not really a progressive, there's times I have to mess with you guys a little bit. Some of you probably finally got it, that Henry Comstock was not really part of the Gilded Age. He's dead before it even starts, right? But he's a segue, you're leading into a development, that becomes important enough. He actually died in 1902, so he dies at the very beginning of the progressive era. He's a pre-progressive. But what he did was he influenced the progressives, and among those he influenced very much was Teddy Roosevelt. And if you can influence the president, you guys all know that's a big deal, right? And the president's going to make the kind of things that he was talking about happen. So let me just tell you about John Wesley Powell. He was born in 1832, and he doesn't really come to any kind of historical significance until the era of the Civil War. He was a Union, become a Union veteran of the Civil War. But he fought in the Battle of Shiloh in 1862. You guys ever heard of Shiloh? But really bloody battle between the North and the South in Tennessee. And like so many in that battle, he was shot, and he wasn't killed, but he was wounded. He got shot below the elbow in his arm. The Minet ball took out probably an inch of his bone or something like that, just really mangled the rest of his arm. And as we already know, if that was the situation when you were wounded, what are they going to do about it? They amputated. So he spent the rest of his life as a one-armed man. There's times when I kind of just, I screwed up, what can I say? In the beginning of my story, I just didn't know what happened next. So I told my students he was done. He walks away from, and wouldn't you think he'd be done, right? You're done with the war, you fought in the Battle of Shiloh, you did everything. He did take a year to convalesce. It was hard to recover from that kind of wound. Just think of all the fevers that you would suffer, the phantom limb issues, all that kind of stuff. But he fought till the end of the war. He actually does continue all through the entire war. He rose to the rank of major, so he's, and that kind of tells the story, right? You don't necessarily need two hands if you're a commanding officer. You tell the people what to do and use the other hand for your saber or your pistol or whatever. You can still do some significant damage just with the one arm. But he fought with Sherman, and he marched to the sea with Sherman, and he actually has quite the heroic career as far as the Civil War. So that was really my bad. I thought he was done. He was not done. He continued the Civil War to the very end. Well, he goes home, and his father was a farmer in Illinois. And his dad took pretty much one look at him, and he said, son, you're just not going to be a farmer. You can't be a one-armed farmer. And the father was trying to be helpful. What else can you do? That's what we do as parents. We want to try to be helpful to our kids. So his dad said, maybe you should be a preacher or a teacher. Those are two things that you don't necessarily have to have that arm for. I have no idea what his issues of faith were, but he turned to the idea of being a teacher, and that he's going to dedicate the rest of his life basically to education. And what he became was, I'm going to call him a professor of earth sciences in Illinois. So he taught at university, at colleges. I'm pretty sure, and forgive me for these little things, I think he taught at Illinois Wesleyan and the University of Illinois, so he's kind of he's in higher education. And he was simply interested very much in geology and geography and things like that, and that will lead him to kind of what will become his first heroic act as far as America is concerned. I don't know that he was a good teacher, don't know anything about his classroom activity. I looked at him, rateyourprofessor.com, I just could not find anything about him at all, haven't cleared what's going on there. Anyway, but I know that he loved being in the field, and that's really the good scientist, right? The scientist who wants to be in the field. And so he begins to take these field trips, and he took students along with him. He wanted them to kind of see what was going on. One of his first field trip areas was just to go into the Rockies of Colorado, into the Rockies to kind of study the Rockies themselves. And what happens is he begins to be the discoverer, if you will, the definer, articulator, and understander and articulator of what they call the parks of Colorado, the parks of Colorado. And don't worry about this anyway, but I don't know if you guys know the concept of the park, but there are in Colorado these huge mossy meadow areas between the mountain ranges. And routinely there are no trees upon them. So the trees come down to some level and then it just goes into this big green area. Okay. They're in the Sierras too, so I'm very familiar with just the nature of this situation. In the Sierras we simply call them meadows because they're not that big. And the meadows of the Sierras are beautiful because you come down like out of the rocky area and then go through the trees and then you hit the meadow. And the meadows, they're usually elongated because they're following the valley and they look like golf courses. They look like they'd be the prettiest golf course you could ever think of. Now they're wet and boggy and routinely they are full of mosquitoes in the summertime, so it's not necessarily the coolest place to hang out or anything like that. But anyway, it was Powell who figured out what was going on here. That originally they had been lakes, but the lakes had simply had to absorb the alluvium off the mountains. They created their own kind of soils began to be generating themselves, and pretty soon the soil would take over the entire lake area because the lakes were routinely relatively shallow, and it became this really boggy meadow. But it was too boggy for trees. So that's all he did was how are these big grassy things formed? Well, this is how they're formed. That's pretty much exactly the way that works. Okay, so that was the first thing he did, and it kind of led to his interest in the West. and beyond, right? And that led him to his great activity here. So here it is. In 1869, he decided to embark on an expedition in the West to explore the last unexplored area of the contiguous United States. All right, so this is the last significantly unexplored area of the contiguous United States. It's kind of an ironic exploration because although no one had gone through it, lots of people had seen it, you know. All you had to do was walk up to the rim. If you guys have ever walked up to the rim, you know what's going to happen. I mean, you are awestruck by the immensity of what you're seeing, the miles across to the other side, of course, the depth of it's a mile deep, basically, at that particular point. The strata, of course, of the rocks on their way down. You know, you can't help but being sort of awestruck when you look at that. And of course, if it's added, the weather added some kind of component to it, it becomes even more awesome in many ways. So he decided that he wanted to be the first person to explore through. Is that enough hint for you guys? Through the Grand Canyon. It's actually, he wanted to do the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, which no white person had ever done, or no one had ever done on purpose in a particular kind of way. I always feel that there might have been that person who accidentally fell in the river. Okay, that's really bad because he probably drowned the whole way, but still, you know, what about Fred? He drowned, he went all the way down to there. Okay, we got to give him some kind of credit. Anyway, so let me just tell you about this. And he plans this expedition on a shoestring. There's no big financial foundation for this in any kind of way. The university gave him a few bucks to help him out. All the people who would go on this were volunteers who simply were willing to go with him, including students. His brother went along. His former sergeant by the name of Brady went along with him, you know, just to grabbing the guys that he could put this together. He asked the federal government for assistance, and you would think the government might assist, right? Because this is an exploration of America. And say what they said was, you can stop at any fort that you come close to and get rations from the fort. There are no forts in that entire. So thanks for nothing, okay? Anyway, puts us all together, okay? Then what they did was, in 1869, they got on the newly constructed Transcontinental Railroad. That thing was built that year, finished that year. And they headed all the way out the river, and they came right to here, okay? And this is the Green River in Wyoming. That was to be the beginning point. The Green River is a tributary of the Colorado River. I've crossed that many times. You're on Highway 80 there. I've actually taken the train across that too. Every time I cross it, I always kind of imagine the moment. There's a little community, it's called Green River, Wyoming, but I'm trying to figure out, you know, is he on this side of the river, on the bridge, or is on that side? You know, where was he, or whatever. Anyway, but that's the location where they're going to start. They had almost no training in water, in this kind of, what do you call that? I want to say wild water rafting. What's the right word? Whitewater rafting, but it's not even rafting, right? Just whitewater transportation, you know, boating one way or the other. And you know, so they really were unprepared in many ways. But he did one thing that was really smart. He had these special made boats made for just this particular expedition. And the critical things about them was that they could go either frontwards or backwards, so they had no bow and no stern. Because you realize there are going to be times when you're just going to be turned around, you can't do anything about it. So all you do is you turn around in your seat, you know, and you'll be just perfectly fine. And they also had watertight compartments. And of course, that was in part to protect their supplies, but more importantly, to protect them from sinking, right? Because if they're going to flip over, and as long as they're watertight, they're going to stay on the surface, and hopefully you'll be able to put it back right at some particular point, right? Anyway, 4 of these boats, 12 men. We're going to go with the 12 men for this class. I went with the 10 men for the other one because I can't remember the number. I've got it covered though, okay? For the next class, I think I'm going to tell them 8, just in case it was fewer than I thought it was. And that'll mean that I am correct at least in one of my classes, and I'll feel really good about that. Anyway, and one of the guys, I have to tell you about this, there was just a kid. He was hanging out in that area, and he was working out in the boats on the river, and Powell sees him. I think he was 18 years old, and he just said to the guy, hey, man, would you like to go on a little trip with us down the river? And the kid said yes, you know. Oh, my God, you know what you're about to do? 90 days on the Colorado. How fun is that? Anyway, took out of Green River and began to simply make their way. And the good news was, in the beginning, it's not that rough, so you kind of get to learn as you're going. But within the first week, they hit their first cataract, so they hit their first serious rapid, and they busted a boat. You know, they won't sink, but if you ram them into a rock or something, you break the boat, of course, and it sank. So one-fourth of their supplies went down. Of course, 1/4 of their transportation had to double up, or at least, you know, add one more person to each boat as they're heading down the Colorado River. As they went, of course, it was the task primarily of Powell just to look and observe. He was not a good person with the oars. You guys know that the one hand, you can work one hand on one oar on one side, but I think that they were double-oared situation. And even a paddle is going to be really hard with one arm. And everybody kind of understood it, you know, that he wasn't going to be effective there. So they put these boards across the gunnel of the boat, one of the boats, and they put a captain's chair on that gunnel. And he would sit in the captain's chair, and they strapped him in so he could just get a better view than anyone else. You guys know the higher you up, the little better view you would get. I do believe that he sometimes rode the rapids on the captain's chair, and you guys all know that has to be exciting, right? Because I always think of the sailors on the top of the mast on those big ships. Just think about it, if the ship is really cut, you could have like a 180-foot arc each time, and whoa, it'd be like, whoa, hang on for dear life or something like that. Anyway, I do not know this to be a fact, but I hope that he yeehawed a couple times. Yeehaw. You got to yeehaw. If he didn't yeehaw, we got ourselves some disappointment going on. Anyway, as he went, of course, he would name places. He's critical in the naming of locations in this area. He came into a beautiful valley just surrounded by super high walls. He thought it looked like a Scottish glen, so he called it Glen Canyon. You know, this is just, here's John Wesley Powell just naming one thing after another. Anyway, I can't tell you too many stories. It's really, it's fun to tell all the stories of this, and I've read numerous books on it just because I really think it was a cool activity. But they finally got into the Colorado proper, of course, and into the canyon proper itself. And you guys probably know that the canyon is like a history of the world in sediments, not sedimentary rock, but sediments of rock going down. When they got to the very bottom of this, and I guess I should set up a little bit better, they had to camp every afternoon, because they can't run at night. That'd be ridiculous. That'd be deadly, right, to do that kind of thing at night. And by the way, they had to portage often. You guys ever heard of that before? What does it mean to portage? Going down the river, you got a portage?
Bathroom?
Yes. They did not go to the bathroom at all. It's a historical fact. They just simply took opiates the entire time. It's sad when I have something to work off there. Oh, God, sorry about that. Anyway, but don't worry. They got themselves those pills for loosening things up. It wasn't good in the beginning. It didn't get any better later. I have to edit that part out. Okay. Here we go. That's when you have to take the boat out of the water itself, and it's really hard, right? You have to unload, carry the boat overland, because you can't go through the waterfall, you can't go through the rapid or whatever, all these things they have to do. I do want you to know that they stopped every afternoon for exploration, right? And it creates a very interesting dynamic of the one-armed man in the vertical realm. You guys all know that's vertical, right? But he wanted to explore. He loved to go wherever he could, and he climbed up the sides of the Grand Canyon upon occasion. And upon occasion, of course, he got himself into some serious difficulties because of the situation. But the most famous one was he got himself on a ledge, and he had a good handhold with his one good hand, and he had his feet in, but he couldn't go up, he couldn't go down, he couldn't go sideways, he couldn't go back. He was stuck, You guys have ever done it, but your muscles are going to start to shake, and quiver like this, and you're holding on. The sergeant by the name of Brady was like his personal assistant. He was always there to help him. And so Brady was desperate because he couldn't get to him and couldn't help him and rescue him in any kind of way. So the only thing he could do is climb up to a ledge above him with no rope whatsoever. And the only thing he could think to do was rip his pants off. And he held on to one trouser leg, and the other trouser leg came within about 18 inches of where Powell's hand was. So you guys know how this has to work, right? He's got to let go of that one handhold, reach up and grab the pant leg. And you all know you get one chance to do that, right? There's no such thing as a second try on that kind of activity. Tragically, he missed it. Powell fell to his death. That's the end of that story. No, just kidding. Did it work at all? It worked! You guys, you believe me way too much. This is an unhealthy thing, okay? I told you to treat me with skepticism all the time. Anyway, of course he grabbed it, and made his way for further adventures, of course. If he's dead there, what other story do I have to tell you? Let me just do the last one of the Grand Canyon. In the depths of the Grand Canyon, you go through what they call the Vishnu Schist. It's the oldest rock of the Grand Canyon, so the river is cut down to it. It's a metamorphic rock, which is super hard, of course, super dense, and the river only can really cut a channel through it. So all you really have is like a channel, oftentimes with no shore at all. That's messed up, right? There's no place to stop, no place to pull over. There are certain rocks and rock falls where you can stop and everything, but it disallowed any notion of portaging whatsoever. You cannot pull the boats out, you cannot transport them at all. And they're going through the Vishnu Schist, and they see a cataract. And you both can see the crest, but you can hear it, right? You just listen to the raging sound of the water. And so they just knew they couldn't approach it, without knowing a little bit about it, because it could be too dangerous. So they were able to get to the side and anchor themselves, essentially. But the only way they could think of to kind of understand what could be, reconnoiter it, was to unload one boat, stick one guy in the boat, and then put all the ropes they had together and just sort of let him out on a tether. They just let him out so that he could get near the crest and he could just look over, without the danger, of course, of going over the falls or anything like that. And you guys know how the story's going to go. They've got him way out on the tether, and the ropes give way, and the last they see of him is just jetting over the waterfall like that. And they're going, oh my God, And they went back to a place where they could get up high and they could see the river about a quarter of a mile down there. And of course, they get up, and finally they see him standing in the boat, give him the high sign so that they could do that kind of thing. Okay. day after day of this, day after day of the danger, day after day of the supplies getting worse and worse in condition, it finally led 3 individuals of the expedition to say that they were done. They just didn't want to do it anymore. You can imagine just the stress of it and the danger of it. You get tired of that kind of stuff, you know. So they went to Powell and they said, we're going to leave. We're just going to hike on out of here. We don't want to stay and try to do the rest of the river. And, you know, Powell pled with them. He said, you guys, we're close, you know, we're just maybe a couple more days or something like that. We're going to be out of this thing. And they just refused. You know, they had made up their mind, we're going to go. And they did. And he couldn't stop them because it's a voluntary group of people. Those are the only 3 who died in the expedition. They got to the rim of the Grand Canyon and were killed by the Native Americans. Their bodies were found about a year later. So that becomes really sad. And they did, and they got to the end of the canyon about 2 days later. So just, you know, if they had just hung it out 2 more days. Anyway, here's our last little story for them, the whole thing. Brigham Young knew what they were doing, so he sent some Mormons down here to where the canyon kind of levels out there, where the calm water is, and just had them waiting to assist, of course, should they make it through. And these guys were waiting and waiting and waiting, and just thinking it was, you know, most they're going to see is like flotsam and jetsam or dead bodies or something like that, you know. But they finally came out, and one of the Mormons, you know, he describes them. They come out of, like, I want to see it coming out of the mist. There's no mist at that time; it's the summer. But let's just say coming out, he described them as an apparition. He said they were like an apparition coming down the river. And we're trying to understand what he meant, but here's what we think he meant. These guys had been 90 days without a shave, without a haircut. Their clothing had just become turned into little pieces of rags, which they were trying to, you know, tie up around their privates and stuff like that. I mean, they looked like wild men coming out. I think that's what he meant, but they had made it through, right? They had completed this particular expedition. And sometimes Powell could be extremely terse, and a newspaper man said to him, how did you guys do it? And he basically said, I don't know. I guess we were lucky. That's all he could say. I guess we were lucky. You know, I have no idea. Now, if you're on a really cool amusement ride and you've done it once, what do you want to do? You want to do it again. So he did it again in 1871. This time, much more prepared. This time, more people. This time, cameras to take photographs of the situation. You know, he knew the river now, so it was a much easier time going down the river the second time, basically. But anyway, the 2 of these trips down the river will allow him kind of to, it's his claim to fame, but it'll allow him to do all these other things that become the essence of really, you know, the life story of John Wesley Powell. So let me just tell you some of the things that Powell's going to do. One of the things that he will do is that he becomes a founder of something called the National Geographic Society. And the National Geographic Society, of course, is most famous for what? Please don't let me down. What are they famous for?
The magazines.
Their magazine. Oh my God, tell me that you know something about this. Anyway, I have been reading this since I could read. I swear to God, my mom and dad got it, you know, when I was a little teeny kid. And, you know, I didn't read the articles, I must admit, but I love the pictures and I read the captions through them. I did that probably into my, like, 50s. I often don't read it. But, you know, if you guys know anything about this, it's just, you know, it's still the same size it used to be because it's still that kind of classic thing. It's not dependent upon the advertising quite so much. But, you know, you look at any one, so this is the new science of the brain. You're going to find all kinds of interesting things. This one deals with the chapel, or the big dome that was built in Florence, you know, so you get kind of this inside look of the whole thing. Lots of fold-outs in terms of this. They're wildlife photography, some of the best in the world. They're going to come to you from the Arctic, you know, from wherever, from space. Just White Castle in New Jersey, for crying out loud. We go get ourselves some little teeny burgers. Anyway, just an amazing thing. This one, you know, focuses on the brain. This one, our wild solar system, you know, suggesting there was a moment, of course, when the moon crashed into the Earth or something like that, crashed into another planet, and making that kind of foundation. This one is about the nature of faith in the world, you know, but not just Christian faith, but all kinds of faith. It has the gorillas in it, too. How fun are the gorillas? Anyway, I brought these really just in case you haven't looked at one before and anyone would like to take one, because my notion is to share them. I've been a subscriber since I was a kid, and when I became independent, I was a subscriber too. I loved them so much that I wouldn't give them away. I never threw them away or recycled them. And it became kind of like an issue of our marriage if I would continue to have all these because they were taking up a huge part of our garage. And so I finally had to let them go. But the funny part of it was that I couldn't let them go that way. I had to look through every single one last time and keep the ones that I thought were most special to myself. I kept like a few of those. There was a time that I was actually going back and buying like from the 1920s and 30s and stuff like that because I just love this stuff, you know. Just amazing stuff. But anyway, you know, to me this is like a huge thing as far as America's concerned. Yes?
Do you have any of the Arctic in there?
Pardon?
Do you have any?
Is there any Arctic stuff? You have to look on I don't have my glasses on. I could probably find one with the Arctic. And the one I gave yesterday, I gave away one that had all the global warming stuff and had all these incredible pictures, of course, of the Arctic environments. But anyway, so a founder of the National Geographic Society, along with others, of course, he's on loan in that regard. He was the second head of the U.S. Geological Survey. This is the USGS. USGS has a very important history in pedagogy kind of in America. It started out as the Corps of Discovery of Lewis and Clark. You guys ever heard of Lewis and Clark, of course, the first government agency of exploration. That evolved to what we call the U.S. Topographical Corps, which did most of the exploration of the United States prior to the Civil War and to a degree afterwards. And that evolved to the U.S. Geological Survey, which is the chief government agency involved with just the nature of our land, one way or the other. Okay? And in the beginning, their job was very straightforward, where they were to map the United States of America, And there was a first guy who was in charge of it, but he lasts like a few months, and then Powell takes it over. He's in charge for 25 years, so he's the man who shapes the nature of the U.S. Geological Survey. Their objective was to map the entire United States of America. They did not finish it until the 1980s, and the irony of the outcome here is that in the second of their completion of it, of course, everything they did was obsolete, because all of a sudden satellites and photography, just amazingly different kind of situation will emerge. But you have to admire these guys. They climbed every peak in America. They went to every low valley in America. They took their barometers, which were heavy things, to try to figure elevations. They came up with what we call the topo maps, or the topographic maps. You guys ever seen these before? It's just a really cool way to see sort of the terrain. And what they do is they use a contour interval, and it depends on what the interval is, but just say this is like 90-foot interval, and the lines are really close to each other. What is that suggesting? Just really steep, right? And if you see something like this, where you have a circle, and then you have a circle inside of it, of course, that's probably going to be your peak, right? And you can also be the obverse. It could be like a valley or a lowland area, one way or the other. But it was a way of kind of, in a two-dimensional way, trying to give you a sense of the multi-dimensions of the landscape. And in the good old days, you would use these, of course, when you would travel through the Sierras, and especially if you want to do cross-country. Nowadays, of course, GPS, it's a new game, right? It's just a totally different situation. Anyway, but he was part of a U.S. Geological Survey. He also was an Indian ethnographer of note. These are the stories of Powell that I just kind of really love to tell you guys. When he went to the Native Americans, he never went like the great white father dude, no? He went like the student of their culture. He admired them and what they had done, and he wanted to learn from them, such a cool attitude for a person of that era to think like that. And because he was like that to them, they loved him. All right? He was adopted by the Havasupai tribe. That's the tribe of the rim of the Grand Canyon area. They adopt him into their tribe. But I have to tell you this one little part. They made a name for him in Havasupai, and if you translate that into English, it was Stumpy. They called him Stumpy. I don't think that was an insulting. They always wanted part of, what is the identifying characteristic of the individual, and something like that would be helpful for them. But they gave him everything. They just threw stuff at him. Whatever he wanted, they would give him. And it became then, he had the largest personal collection of Indian artifacts in the entire world. No one had more than Powell. And of course, what does Powell do? He turns it over to the Smithsonian. He doesn't want this for himself. He wants this for the nation. And that is the foundation of what I think is the best museum in the United States, the Smithsonian. It's the Museum of Native American History. They did that thing so beautifully. They don't try to overwhelm you. Museums can really kill you sometimes, right? There's like so much stuff and so much stuff to read. You kind of go crazy in there. And this museum decided, there's only so much that we want to bother these people with. And we'll change it all the time. That's the cool part. There's tons of stuff, right? But they're going to change it all the time. But they make it so it's just like, you go to these tribes and you get to hear the words of the people, you get to hear the language itself, what they call themselves. They just did a really beautiful job. And they made it kind of like a symbolic Native American building. So it has a kiva. A kiva is a round spiritual area. But that kiva is actually a 4-story rotunda. It's huge, okay? I'll never forget being in that museum for the first time, and I heard this incredible sound coming from the kiva, and I walk over, and these 3 Choctaw are standing in the bottom of the kiva, and they're singing a Christian hymn in Choctaw. And I swear it was like the angels coming up through, because you're hearing like that sound in this weird sounding of the rotunda itself. And I thought, oh my God, I'm listening to the word of God from God, or something like that. Just this amazing kind of sound, the whole thing. Anyway, but all that collection was founded by the artifacts of John Wesley Powell, so that's really cool. Ultimately, though, here's our critical point, of course. He becomes this voice in the wilderness for conservation. He's the first person to really promote conservation. The way he came about this was almost like accidental. He's not like really thinking about it that much necessarily. But he's going down the Grand Canyon and he's just perceiving the nature of the West. And he began to realize that there is one resource that is most important and very limited as far as the West is concerned. And help me out, what is it here in the southwestern part of the United States?
Water.
It's water. Water is just amazingly critical, but also amazingly kind of lacking from this particular area. And so we began to think about, oh my God, water is really critical out here, and I think we need to really be careful about how we use water, and we need to husband our water and make sure that we're concerned. You know, when the thing is, it began a thought process. So once he starts with water, he starts to think about the forest. Oh my God, there's only so much forest in America. I mean, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to cut the whole damn forest down. We've got to begin to think about that. And that led him to think about the grasslands. Oh, there's only so much grassland in America. If we overgraze the grasslands, then that could be just a disaster. And then he started to think about the soil. There's only so much soil in America. You know, we need to be careful how we are using the soil and making sure that this will be able to be used in perpetuity. And here's the part of the irony of the story. He traveled across America and he would present his story of going down the Colorado. That's what everyone wanted to hear, right? And by the way, when he took that camera, they made those into like slides. We would call them a magic lantern kind of show. And so he could project, so people could see exactly what he was talking about. It was a really good show and everybody loved it. And so he'd do that show, tell the exciting story of going down the Grand Canyon, but he would always end by talking about conservation. That's the end, that was his like final preach to the people. In the beginning, he got booed. People booed him, you know, because Americans do not like to be told there are limitations to anything, right? There's no way in hell that there's not enough land and not enough trees or whatever, you know. But over time, he just kept at it, you know. So he convinced more and more people, and among those that he would convince, of course, was Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt will make this happen. What John Wesley Powell thought was the way that we should proceed will become the essential reality of behavior for the progressive North. And what that leads to then is my second example. And that is conservation. You know, this is the actual policy and activity of the Roosevelt administration. Absolutely influenced by John Wesley Powell, but of course Roosevelt has to take it and make it something for himself. As I'm sure you guys can imagine, he could not do everything. He's the president of the United States, so he has to assign people to do certain things. Then the man that he assigned to do this was a man by the name of Gifford Pinchot. I could not remember his name. I was hoping it would happen before I got to the board. It did. Yay! Could have not told you that. You would have just thought I knew everything. I like to be transparent with character. I always can't help but tell you like the little weird things. When I was 15, I did a 100-mile backpack through the Sierras, and we went onto this pass called Pinchot Pass. I'll never forget this Pinchot Pass. Because we're 12,000 feet up. You guys ever been up there? You know, it's like you're above the tree line. It's just rock and snow and just sky. Just kind of an amazing, beautiful area. But we got to the peak, and a thunderstorm came in and just smashed us right there, right on the pass itself. And just lightning bolts hitting all around us. And I mean, they felt like they were right next door, just big lightning bolts. And you could smell this weird smell, and I think it was the lightning bolt hitting the rock, and then the rocks kind of disintegrating, and smelling like the granite piece. It was just a weird thing. And so we were just trying to find a little bit of shelter, and all you could do is like scramble into the big rocks that are just big boulders that have fallen down, all of them really rough face, because they're just falling off the mountain or whatever. And we found, like, there were 4 of us, and Keith and I found a little place where we could just get out of the rain, you know, just feel a little bit protected. But it was so tight that we had to stand right next to, I mean, he was standing like right here. And so, you know, just kind of awkward. We're 2 15-year-old boys, and we're, you know, we thought if one of us would turn, and that would be awkward too. You know, we're like, let's just keep like this, you know. But I'll never forget, I'm looking at Keith right in the face, very closely to him too, okay, and a lightning bolt hits near us. And he just shook his whole body. It just had this quiver go down his body. And it just made me laugh. And of course, he starts laughing because I'm pretty sure I did the exact same thing. So we're just about to die, but really enjoying ourselves on Pinchot Pass. But I always wonder, what the hell who's this Pinchot? You know, what's that all about? Well, it was named after Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot becomes a major player in terms of conservation. Pinchot is totally different than John Wesley Powell. Pinchot was not learning about what he was going to do in the West. He was learning about this in Europe. He goes to Europe to receive his higher education. I think he was a graduate student at the university in Germany or something like that. And in Germany, he learned about conservation because the Europeans were much more keen on the idea of conservation than the Americans. Why would Europeans be much sooner to go to the issue of conservation than Americans?
Because they exasperated their resources.
Because they had messed it up, right? They had screwed up everything. The Germans, it hit the Germans right about the midpoint of the 19th century when they chopped down the final tree of the Black Forest. So the Black Forest, a famous German forest, was gone. And it's like when they chopped that final tree down, they're going, oh my God, we've destroyed the forest. I mean, they couldn't believe what they'd done. And of course they thought, we can't let this happen. So they replanted the forest. I love this, you know, we can't let it happen, we gotta replant it. But when they replanted it, they just do a very scientific thing. They planted it on a grid. And you guys know that that's not the way a forest is at all. The good news was in the early years of the forest being rebuilt, you know, you could like walk down the straight line, the trees. the tree. The tree, you know. So that would give you a sense of direction or something like that. If you guys have ever been in old growth forest, it is chaos, you know. Go out, we've done that, we take off and we go off the trail, and we would get lost so fast because it just turns into chaos. You can't, dead trees everywhere, you're jumping over this, you're trying to figure out where the hell you are, you're going to get lost in it like a heartbeat, basically. Anyway, so Gifford Pinchot, you know, he's going to learn from the Germans who had figured out earlier, the Europeans also, and they were already beginning to try to conserve. They replanted the Black Forest because they said, we've got to have a forest, we cannot let that go. Anyway, what the Europeans were promoting was a concept called sustainable yield. One thing you need to know about conservation, it does mean to use. You are not using, okay? It means to use, but to use wisely. That's the whole concept of conservation, to use wisely. And sustainable yield meant that you are going to take away. That's the yield. You will take away, but you're going to guarantee, or try to guarantee, that that yield is sustainable, that yield will continue on and on and on. So help me out here. If you chop a tree down in the forest, what do you have to do? Plant another one. Okay, it's as simple as that, right? Just make sure that there's another tree that will go in that place. You guys ever seen clear cutting? Clear cutting is a way that they do forest, you know, do lumbering. And clear cutting means they go into the forest and they chop every damn tree down. It's harsh looking when you see it, right? Because you're driving through a beautiful forest, and all of a sudden you see, it looks like someone took a buzzsaw to all the trees, which is exactly what they did, and all the trees are down, you know, so it looks horrible, but if you look closely, you would find that next to every single stump, there is a new seedling that they put in. And I have to tell you that it's still damaging to the environment because you chop down all the trees, you're taking away the ecosystem, right? You're getting rid of the canopy and all the animals that would live there. You're exposing the soil momentarily to more rainfall, which can go down and cause all kinds of problems in the rivers and streams. You know, it is problematic in many ways, but still, it is something that we've done routinely. This is weird when you're just driving through the forest and you begin to realize the reality of kind of the way that we do lumber with the forest. But I was driving on Highway 89 north of Truckee. And if you're driving, the road's elevated, so you're looking over the top of the canopy. So all the trees were right about this level. And then on a straight line, they jumped 20 feet. Swear to God, you know, straight line, 20 feet jump in canopy height. And there's no way in hell that that's a naturally occurring phenomenon. You know? So what that meant was these are two areas that had been harvested before, and they replanted them, of course, like 20 years apart or something like that. And this is the growth of this one, and that's the growth of another one. On the Olympic Peninsula, they have put down little signs to tell you when they've harvested the forest. And for my purpose, it was really cool. But this one forest, I mean, it had 3 harvests. That's pretty cool. So the first one was like 1906, and the second one was 1935, and the third was 1963. And the trees in that area were pretty damn big. I mean, that's going to be the 4th harvest they're going to take out of that. You know. So anyway, the one way that they would do this, of course, is through replanting the soil. And I've run out of time for you guys after what you go. But there's a lot of really other interesting things about this stuff. If anyone would like a copy of the National Geographic, please feel free to take one.